Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for Working Group 6 of the Gas Resource Management Working Group Series. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be helping out with the web conference portion of today. I'm also joined on the line by our facilitator, Mark Richardson. Before we get started, just a couple items to go over. The presentation that we'll be sharing today is available out on the Policy Initiative stakeholder page. So you can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, and then under the Stay Informed tab, you'll want to click Policy Initiatives. That will take you out to our main initiative landing page where you can scroll down and find the Gas Resource Management page. And then the presentation will be one of the very first items posted there. As usual, this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need technical assistance at any point during today's meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. Our event producer today is Yolande. And then we will be pausing for questions and comments throughout the call today, so if you connected to audio through your computer and use the Call Me option in WebEx, you can raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you connected to audio only, then you'll need to press #2 to raise your hand, and that will enter you into the phone only queue. We'll keep an eye on both the phone lines and the WebEx hands as we go through today, and then you can also send your question or comment through the chat. You can send it either directly to me, again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists, and we'll keep an eye on those as well. And then just a reminder to please state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question, so we know who the comment or question is coming from. All right, with that, I'm going to hand things over to Mark to take us through our agenda for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Isabella. And just to confirm, you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's already December. Hope everyone had good holidays a few weeks back for Thanksgiving. So today, I'm really hoping we can kind of start diving into potential solutions, and we have a few things kind of teased up today to kind of help us kind of start thinking about the various scenarios and things like that. So today, the focus problem statements are going to be around the resource-specific cost adjustments, specifically problem statement 6, 7, 9, and 10. And what those are and what those focuses are the automated reference level adjustments, the manual reference level adjustments, multiple fuel zones, and then the different types of fuels. And I know for the different types of fuel, I definitely look forward to that conversation because I would like to understand what exactly that looks like. We've had a few conversations offline with various entities, and I'm hoping they're willing to speak up today to kind of help get that conversation rolling. So again, we're going to be reviewing the problem statements and related discussion to date, review the discussion and existing tools intended to kind of facilitate that resource-specific cost adjustment that is available to you today. We have Katie Wickler, who's going to be walking through the educational piece on that. And as we walk through that educational piece, I'm going to kind of challenge the audience to kind of start thinking about what scenarios they're facing to the extent they need to leverage one of the existing processes, and in those scenarios where those challenges lie. That way, that could kind of really help us start thinking about what solutions we need to consider in this policy development. And then lastly, we're going to talk about, kind of going through the discussion scenarios again to get stakeholders thinking about the various items. Sylvie Spiewak is going to be joining us here shortly. She has a few slides that kind of tee up some of those scenarios to kind of help us kind of further dive on solutions. And then lastly, we'll cover next steps. So really look forward to a engaged and collaborative conversation today. I will be calling on some of those entities that I've presented some associated comments in the past, so heads up on that now. So thank you in advance, and let's dive in. All right, so problem statement 6, and then this one again is around the automated reference level adjustments. The current problem statement that has been posted out there for a while now is the automated reference level change request process can only be submitted for one resource at a time. That was a challenge that many stakeholders face. The existing process at a high level, and again, Katie's going to dive into that here shortly, is the automated request process can be submitted anytime prior to the close of the applicable market, whether it's day ahead or real time. Suppliers are expected to submit automated requests based on those verifiable costs. If the requested adjustment request falls below that reasonableness threshold, and again, depending on the day of the week, it's either 10% or 25%. Katie will get into that here shortly. It will pass that automation, and to the extent the reasonableness threshold is above that, that's when we kind of the process is to kind of push stakeholders to that manual reference level adjustment process. So those particular thresholds act as a cap on those submitted costs to protect against market power in gaming from an overall background and context perspective. What we've heard so far is, hey, instead of having this process only allowing one resource at a time per submission in cyber, let's think about how we can allow multiple resources at a time, whether that's at the fuel zone level. We heard earlier on potentially at the SCID level, what would that look like? So definitely look forward to getting into some solutions. So again, as I stated earlier, I'm going to have Katie walk through the current educational piece just to make sure everyone's on the same page with automated reference level adjustments, what the current processes are. Think about the scenarios that you guys face today in representing those costs and some of the challenges in these processes. To the extent you have questions on the educational process, by all means raise your hand. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through that education piece, jump back to this slide. Again, you guys have been thinking about those scenarios, and then let's start talking about potential solutions. So at this point, unless there's any questions before we move on to the educational piece, I'm going to turn it over to Katie. So let's pause just for 1 second here, Isabella. By all means, raise your hand if you have a question, and then definitely look forward to getting some education here. All right, I'm not hearing or seeing any. Can we confirm there's no one that had pressed #2 on the audio side?
There are no questions in either line.
All right, fantastic. All right, well, let me turn it over to you, Katie, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie Wickler. I'm a senior market engineering specialist at the analysis team here at the ISO. Our team is the one that sort of deals with these reference level change requests. And so just hoping to provide a little more education here today. I know we went through some of this material at a previous working group, but that was a bit more information we were covering. And so kind of just hoping to zoom in on these processes and provide a little bit more detail that will hopefully help the conversation and bring folks up to speed if they're not familiar with these processes. So in general, the reference level change request process, just wanted to give an overview. So what we mean by reference levels, we're referring to DEBs, default energy bids, default startup costs, and default minimum load costs. And so we calculate these reference levels using gas prices and resource parameters, gas prices, of course, for those gas-fired resources. And so the scheduling coordinators who expect to have fuel, or what we say fuel equivalent costs for the non-sources, if they expect that those costs will exceed the costs that we are using to calculate those reference levels, that's a scenario in which the reference level change request tool is sort of designed to be used. And so that's a process by which you can go in and request an update to those reference levels, and we will review those via the standard processes we have for either the manual or the automated process. So those are two sort of separate processes we're talking about. And before I jump in, what I will say is we have a ton of detail on both of these processes in the BPM, the BPM for Market Instruments Attachment O. So I'd suggest taking a look at that as well. There's a lot of good detail there. But let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so just a little more sort of side-by-side information about the automated and the manual. And I'll get into the manual a little bit later in this presentation. But I thought for setting the stage, I'll cover both of these now. So the timeline for both of these is a little bit different. The automated, as Mark mentioned, that can be submitted at any time prior to the close of the applicable market. So prior to 10 a.m. for the day-ahead market, and then prior to each individual real-time hours cutoff for the real-time market. In contrast, The manual process needs to be submitted by 8 a.m. Pacific time on the day that that applicable market is executed. So for tomorrow's day-ahead market, that would be by 8 a.m. today. For today's real-time market, that would also be by 8 a.m. today. The way that those are submitted is a little bit different. So the automated requests are submitted by the scheduling coordinators directly in Cyber, whereas the manual request is submitted via city ticket that routes to my team. The way that these are reviewed is also a little bit different. So the automated requests, those are basically automatically validated in Cyber in the bidding platform against what we call the reasonableness threshold. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's calculated. But those are submitted directly in Cyber, they're automatically validated in Cyber, and so there's sort of no pre-market approval or submission to my team. Whereas the manual request, that's sort of what we do. And so the request is reviewed by my team, we manually validate it between approximately 8 and 9 a.m. Pacific time. In terms of supporting documentation, generally, yes, both of them require supporting documentation. The way that we sort of facilitate that is a little bit different by process. So the automated request, there's nothing that you have to submit or show up front, but we do expect that you retain any supporting documentation that justifies that increased fuel price that you're requesting. We do have audit authority on these automated requests. So after the fact, we can come back and take a closer look at any of these requests. And at that point, we would expect to see that documentation that you've retained. The manual request supporting documentation is needed, and that will be submitted in the city ticket that's submitted by 8 a.m. Pacific time. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. So zooming in a little bit on the automated process, we'll get to the manual later, but for the automated process, like we mentioned, the scheduling coordinator is going to submit that adjustment to their DEB and their commitment cost bid caps directly in Cyber prior to the close of the applicable market. Last time we reviewed the formulations for the cost-based DEB and the proxy commitment costs. Those do include multipliers, so 110% gets multiplied to the overall DEB value that we calculate, and then 125% gets multiplied against the proxy commitment cost that we calculate. Those multipliers cannot be included in the submitted adjustment values that are submitted in Cyber. The reason being is that we include those multipliers as sort of a way to provide a little bit of extra headroom to account for potential mismatches in what we're estimating the cost to be versus what your costs are that you're facing. And so we'd expect that when you're submitting this automated adjustment, you have a more solid idea of what those costs are. And so those sort of additional headroom multipliers can't be included in that adjustment. If those adjustments are submitted in time, if they're timely before the applicable market, Cyber will take them and compare them to what we call a reasonableness threshold. And I'll get into that calculation. But in general, if the request comes in below the threshold, the request goes through, is accepted by the system. If the request is higher than the threshold, the request is what we call partially accepted. It's essentially capped at the threshold value. And so that is what goes in and gets used market. There is an opportunity to request aftermarket cost recovery if your request does exceed the threshold and gets capped. There is an avenue to pursue aftermarket cost recovery in those scenarios.
Hey, Katie,
Let's go to
can I
Sure.
jump in real quick and just ask you a question? Apologies for putting you on the spot. For the aftermarket, and I'm trying to recall some of the previous conversations we had in this forum. For the aftermarket cost recovery, is submitting a automated reference level adjustment kind of that qualifier in order to pursue that? Like that needs to be in place. I think that's an important note here for the community, just to ensure everyone's aware.
That's right. Yeah, I think I have a slide on aftermarket
Okay.
cost recovery a little bit later, but
Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
that's generally one of the ways that an entity may be eligible to receive that cost recovery is if the automated request is submitted and capped. So that's sort of yeah, like you mentioned, that's a
Got it.
qualifier in one instance.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. This might be a good time to pause and see if there's any questions from the folks on the line.
All right, fantastic. All right, so if you have a question or comment as it pertains to the educational side of things, please raise your hand or press #2. I'd be happy to call on you. And again, as Katie's walking through this, think about some of those scenarios you face and be ready to talk about those and all that fun stuff once we get back to solutions here in a sec. Not seeing any hands. Can we confirm there's no #? Oh, thank you, Ryan. Let's go to Ryan with the CPUC.
This is Ryan Sarai from the Public Advocate's Office at the California Public Utilities Commission. I just had a quick question regarding how reference levels work, just trying to get a little more information on how they work. I think I read comments in the Gas Resource Management Working Group, maybe from Salt River Project back in July, where they were noting that the CAISO posts its gas price index for each calendar day, which I believe is a metric that scheduling coordinators need to submit reference levels to the CAISO. I just wanted to ask, I just wanted to confirm if the gas price index is like a metric used for reference levels and what exactly it is, if that's relevant.
Yeah. Hey, Ryan, thanks for the question. And in the next slide, I will get into a little bit more detail about how that reasonableness threshold is calculated. So we can go through that and let me know if that answers your question. But on the fuel price, you're right that, you know, for the gas-fired resources, that is definitely an important component to establish the reference levels, what those values are. And I don't have a slide on this here, but I think we covered it in the last working group education section. We post the fuel region prices that we use for the real-time market. We post that to our public system OASIS for each what we call fuel region index hub. And so that gets up there for the real-time market. We're able to post those. We take basically a weighted average of the vendor prices that we receive, the external vendor prices. For the day-ahead market, we don't post those. The reason being is that we take those prices from the values that are trading live on the Intercontinental Exchange trading platform. We source those between 8 and 9 a.m. and sort of pull those prices that are in the midst of trading and use those to calculate the day-ahead reference level values. And so, you know, we have our gas prices that we're using from those indices in order to calculate these reference levels. But of course, we understand that scheduling coordinators who are having to go out and procure gas may be procuring gas at a different price than what we're using. And so that was sort of the onus behind establishing this whole reference level change request process to begin with, is recognizing that there may be differences between what the scheduling coordinators are procuring at and the values we're using in our calculations. And so the intent of these processes is to give scheduling coordinators an avenue by which they can request a different fuel price to be used in those calculations. Does that help answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I guess from the comments that I've read so far, it's not just an issue with like the sources of data being different and what the scheduling coordinators value versus what the CAISO values, but there's also difficulty in the timing, right? Like by the time scheduling coordinators have to submit reference levels, I guess some of the SCs have noted that there's like a mismatch in when the CAISO provides data and how much time scheduling coordinators need to submit accurate reference levels. Do I have that right as well?
Correct, yeah, and I'll defer to Mark on the specific problem statement, but we have heard that, especially in the context of the manual process, due to the timing.
Right. Yeah. So what we kind of heard, just to provide a little context, is the 8 a.m. kind of bumps up against some of the other trading activities that are going on, and there was some conversation around, is there potential to be able to kind of delay that 8 a.m. deadline, and to the extent we do, what are the trade-offs there? And I think we'll be able to absolutely kind of dive into that here in a minute when we start talking about solutions. So appreciate that, Ryan.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask one more question?
Please, floor is yours.
Floor is mine. Thank you. And this is all different from like when scheduling coordinators submit their proposed reference levels. That's different from the uh, gas nomination cycles, right? Like that's a different procedure in terms of these market processes that scheduling coordinators are involved in, like all the issues that Kaisa was bringing up regarding the nomination cycles and the timing of those. That's different from the timing of submitting reference levels, right?
Correct.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Awesome. Appreciate it. All right. Any other questions or comments from the audience from a educational standpoint? All right. That's it. All right. I'll turn it back to you, Katie. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so I just wanted to include a couple of the calculations to kind of build into how the reasonableness threshold is calculated. And I'm sort of a visual person, so this helps me sort of conceptualize what we're talking about when we say the threshold. I put an example here for the minimum load cost component specifically, although in the BPM, you'll find that we have all this information for the startup costs and the DEBs as well. But just sort of building into what the reasonableness threshold calculation is. So we start with the proxy minimum load cost. That's the value we calculate in our systems. And so we're, for a gas resource, we're taking into account the heat rates that the unit has at minimum load, their PMIN, the fuel region price. That's what, Ryan and I were just discussing, that price that we source and calculate for both markets. We'll also include any sort of variable O&M costs, grid management charges, and GHG if that's applicable for the resource. So that's the proxy minimum load cost. The default minimum load cost takes all of that and multiplies it by 125%. And if we're not talking about the automated adjustment, if we're just talking about normal bidding conditions, this default minimum load cost is the value up to which scheduling coordinators can bid their minimum load bids. So that's that sort of standard 125% cap we've been discussing. When we get into the reasonableness threshold calculation, and again, I'll reiterate that the reasonableness threshold only really comes into play when we're talking about submitting automated adjustments. So what we'll do is we'll take the fuel region price that's sort of built into the formula, and we'll multiply it by what we call the fuel price scalar. So the fuel price scalar, the value of that depends on the day of the week that we're talking about. So we set that at 125% on days without a published gas price index. So for example, that would be the weekends or the holidays when gas isn't trading on a daily basis. Of course, for the weekends, gas is trading on Friday or Saturday, Sunday, Monday, typically. And so when you get into the weekend, that price may be stale. We want to give a little bit more of a scalar on that fuel price. On the days with a published gas price index, so for example, on the weekdays when we're getting that trading and that price regularly, we'll set that scalar to 1.1. So that gets set depending on the day of the week. That gets built into the formulation. We'll also apply that 125%. And then when the scheduling coordinator goes to submit their automated adjustment, that's the value that the system compares their submitted adjustment against. And I have sort of a visual example of what that looks like on the next slide. Okay, so just an example here with some numbers. So let's assume that the default minimum load cost is $5,000 per hour. That's what we calculate. We also calculate that the reasonableness threshold minimum load cost is $6,500. So the first scenario, a scheduling coordinator comes in, they submit an automatic adjustment into Cyber. and they submit that at a value of $6,000. Because that $6,000 is below the reasonableness threshold, that initial adjusted bid will go through. That'll be accepted at the $6,000 and be sent to the market. In another scenario, a scheduling coordinator comes in and submits an adjustment, and they submit that at $7,000 per hour. That's above the reasonableness threshold, and so the system will cap that adjustment at $6,500. That $6,500 gets sent to the market, and then that additional $500 above the reasonableness threshold that wasn't able to be reflected in the adjusted bid, that may be eligible for aftermarket cost recovery sort of down the line. Let's see. Guess I'll pause here and see if there's any questions. I saw there might be something in the chat.
All right, let me pause here. So the chat was just me making sure some individuals were kind of comfortable with me calling on them once we get into solutions. Are there any questions for Katie regarding these adjustments, how those caps hit in these associated scenarios? And Katie, maybe I'll ask you, to the extent an automated request hits that threshold, at that point in time, the next, and we're going to talk about it here in the future, is, now you got to go over to the manual reference level adjustment process and walk through that, correct? Is that kind of the flow of events?
Right, that could be sort of one of the next steps in the decision tree. Generally the automated tool is really useful because it gives scheduling coordinators a bit more flexibility to kind of go in and submit those adjustments at any time. The caveat is that they are subject to that reasonableness. So if those costs, are going to far exceed the reasonableness threshold, then, the manual option is sort of there as a subsequent option for them to pursue.
Right. Got it. Okay, that makes sense. All right, any questions from the audience on this? And I believe, Katie, this was your last slide from an educational perspective, correct? And if so, we can jump back up to slide 5.
I think I have one more, but it's not much more. I think we've sort of covered most of it. So I can just run through that super quick.
Please, go for it.
Sure. So just a couple final thoughts here on the automated process. So the adjustments need to be submitted per resource and per configuration. And so unlike the manual process, which folks might also be familiar with, where you're submitting a gas price, what you're submitting in the automated process is your recalculation of those reference levels with your revised gas price. And so those have to go in similar to a bid. Those have to go in per resource and per configuration. Folks may be familiar with the API functionality in Cyber. If that's the case, then that functionality can also be leveraged to submit adjustments similar to how you submit bids. So that's sort of an option there. As we mentioned, the unrecovered costs above the threshold can be eligible for cost recovery. I have a slide on that later. And then, as I mentioned, we do have an audit function to check these after the fact. And so we expect that any adjustments are supported by documentation that is retained by the scheduling coordinator.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. Looks like we had a hand shoot up. Let's go to Emmy.
Previous slide, if there is a concern that the cost min load bid actually needs to be higher, are you looking for a bid of 6,000 or 5,000 in order to meet the requirement to potentially go into aftermarket recovery? Or 6,500?
Yeah, thanks, Emmy, for the question. I think generally the expectation is that you are bidding in accordance to what your costs are. In this scenario, we had two scenarios, one where your costs were a bit above the default minimum load cost, so you had to go through this automated process, but they were below the reasonableness threshold, so those went through. If you found that your costs were, in the second scenario, 7,000, and you use this automated tool, here you'd find that you get capped at that 6,500. And so it's really
so
up
just,
to you.
yeah,
And
just bid what the cost is and then see what happens after. Okay. So, thank
right,
you.
yeah, and if of course if we're using a gas price that's say $5 an MMBTU, and you're faced with a situation where your gas price is $45 per MMBTU, that's going to be far and above what we're using. That might be a scenario where the manual process might be leveraged, so you wouldn't have to be capped at that reasonableness threshold, which is going to give you as much headroom as you would need in that scenario, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Emmy. I saw Paul Wood from Pat hand shoot up and then went back down. Paul, did you still have a question? If so, please raise your hand. Happy to call on you. All right, let's go to Paul's line.
Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, and I'm trying to catch up with what you guys are explaining, and we appreciate the time and effort you guys are putting into to kind of walk us through this. I just want to make sure that WePack is able to capture the different gas hubs that we transact at, which would be used for the pricing of obviously our gas resources. In addition, we're still trying to get comfortable with when the morning index is used, let's say Tuesday for Wednesday, yet the awards aren't coming out until 1 o'clock, and trying to, reconcile that the gas market obviously is changed, and in some periods it can be drastically different, either much higher or much lower than where the gas index was, that was used for the initial run. The third point is when you're talking about the weekend where you have a Friday setting up for Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Currently, the gas market trades that way, yet those 3 days can have vastly different gas needs, which would result in different, gas prices.
Right. So I think what I hear you saying, Paul, is, hey, if gas is trading, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, how do we, to the extent something happens on Sunday and gas costs raise, yet the index price that was captured doesn't reflect that, how do we reflect those additional costs? Is that where you're going?
Exactly. I mean, probably,
okay.
I don't know, 75% of the year, it's pretty, flat. Not pretty flat, but I mean, there's less volatility. It's in the winter or the summer when, things drastically change from Friday to Sunday that, gas availability could be really limited. So if you're caught short and you're now having to procure gas, to cover your award, it's going to be vastly different than where the Friday index was.
Got it. No, I think that's a good point. So let me go to Katie first to talk about the multiple hubs. I will do my best to articulate what I believe the current processes are, just kind of listening in through this working group process as the facilitator. But by all means, if an ISO SME wants to correct me or raise their hand to opine on how an entity would reflect those, I'm going to just quote unquote inflated costs or different costs that are now higher throughout the weekend, I'd be happy to call on you. So Katie, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul, for the question. Just a couple thoughts that came to mind. I guess on a small point on the weekend, that's touched on the fuel scalar that we use in the reasonableness threshold. We do try and give a little bit more of a margin on those weekend reasonableness thresholds that we're calculating by using that 125 scalar on the fuel instead of 110. But of course, if, you know, in the scenario you're discussing, if the price moves a lot more than that, then you're sort of in a different situation. But on the fuel hubs, I think the first thing you mentioned, I do have a couple slides on that later in this presentation, but you know, the extent that you have different resources cited at different fuel hubs that may have different transport costs for different pipelines, that's something that we can work with you to reflect in our systems. We have a whole process by which we can set up those custom fuel hubs and make them really customized to your resource or resources, depending on where they're situated on the pipeline. So, you know, that's sort of a way we can get a little bit more customized and a little bit more, you know, closer to what that resource is actually facing in terms of their fuel costs and their transport costs.
Thank you, Katie. And just to maybe go a little deeper on, you know, if costs are now rising through the weekend due to various events, you know, I heard you state, Katie, that, you know, hey, by default for a proxy unit, you know, you can go up to 125% of that originally calculated 100% costs. And to the extent that 25% quote unquote buffer doesn't meet the needs in reflecting that actual cost, that's when that next step, based on what we just learned today, is that automated reference level adjustment, which, given it's a weekend, I believe would have the, am I right in saying the reasonable threshold would be 25% there, Katie?
On the, yeah, the fuel scalar.
For the fuel scalar itself. Correct. Okay. And then to the extent that still doesn't cover the entity, is that next step the manual reference level adjustment? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the thinking there is right. I guess the one thing I'll say is that for the manual process, you know, it's a manual process that my team is reviewing, and so we're not able to process those over the weekend. That's something that's really only facilitated on business days, and so there's, you know, that's an additional scenario we could explore, sort of what would happen if that had to be submitted over a weekend. What would that mean and sort of entail for potential cost recovery after the fact? That's sort of a different discussion.
Okay. No, that's perfect. And I think, Paul, I appreciate you kind of presenting that scenario, because that's exactly what we were looking for. Did we have any more questions for Katie as it pertains to these educational slides? If not, I propose we jump back up to slide 5 and start thinking about some solutions. Not seeing any hands, so Isabella, if you wouldn't mind, let's jump back up to slide 5. So first of all, thank you, Katie, for walking us through that. So one of the potential solutions that we heard through this conversation was to allow for multiple resources to be represented on a submission at the fuel zone, right? Right now, it's at a resource by resource basis via Cyber. Again, we're talking about the automated reference level adjustments right now. We will get into the manual reference level adjustments. I think what we'll see when we start talking about the manual reference level adjustments is the ISO staff went back and looked at requests from this community of, okay, well, how many manual reference level adjustments are we getting? And the answer there was not many. So we're looking to understand why that is. Does that infer the reasonableness threshold suffice? So let's kind of turn it over to the audience now. Is this potential solution, does this allow the community to further leverage more frequently the automated reference level adjustment process, or is there anything else missing here based on that process that we just laid out that we think would be beneficial? So I know a few of you have experience in the automated reference level adjustments, so to the extent you're comfortable, please raise your hand. I'd be happy to call on you. All right, thank you, Alan. Let's go to Alan at EDF.
Mark? Can you hear me?
Alan, now we can. Good morning.
A little bit of a delay there. Hey, so thanks for calling on me. This is Alan Padgett, EDF. So first, one of the challenges we have is that we typically, we look at the day ahead market, and if we see we're not economic to run, we don't non-gas. And yet the day ahead awards will come out and we will clear for typically, an unexpected award, and it can be a significant amount. Now we're faced with the same day gas market, right? By that point, though, it's too late to submit adjusted bids or reference or a manual or adjusted level reference level adjustment bids, because the award's already come out. You've already cleared for your min load cost, your startup cost, which is the bulk of your costs for running your asset, right? So what's left is incremental energy, and if you've been picked up at the top, there's really no need to submit anything in real time. So that's one challenge. You clear,
Well,
you get awards.
Can I jump in real quick, Alan? I want to make
Sure.
sure I followed you there. So I heard you say, hey, to the extent from an energy perspective, we're, obviously there's must offer obligations and all that fun stuff to the extent a unit sold RA. So offers are in, but to the extent you're not anticipating an award based on your forecasted prices in the day ahead, some practices out there are to not nominate the gas because you're not expecting to run. And then, hey, we see we now got awarded. Real time rolls around. You're now facing a different gas timeline on trying to secure that fuel in real time. So are you saying, well, hey, now that we've been kind of quote unquote locked in at that day ahead min load and startup costs, right? That was part of some of the CCW changes. EDF or other participants are now don't have a way to reflect the cost that they now face in real time procuring gas at a different real time price. Did I follow that right? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.
I would also say add on to typically it's it may be RUCs. You get a number of RUCs on your assets, and that tends to happen a lot on weekends when you don't expect to get dispatched. And of course, the weekend gas market's pretty illiquid, so you tend to pay up for gas if you need it. And likewise, if you happen to procure gas and you don't get picked up, you're usually selling it at a significant discount. So you're kind of getting the worst of both worlds there. Maybe one thought would be is if you do get RUC'd, should there be a separate process to get cost reimbursement for RUCs, since it was not really an economic dispatch? Maybe that's something we can consider.
So real quick, Alan, and I really appreciate this. I just want to make sure I'm tracking for everybody. So sure. I know there's, and not to go down the rabbit hole of bid cost recovery, I believe RUC is part of BCR. So when you talk about cost reimbursement, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, so BCR only works up to the 125% cap, right? Or
got it. Okay, so you're saying above and beyond.
If your fuel costs are above and beyond that, which it does occur, especially for assets that are in SP15 dealing with SoCal Citygate gas, you can see significant same-day gas that's above the all-in bid-in cost even at 125%. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So I haven't heard you say anything yet pertaining to the current proposed solution. Are you saying you guys don't necessarily face a challenge with submitting on a single resource by resource basis, or would you also like to see the ability? It's timing, especially doing adjustment bids. It's a challenge because you're under, if you do see a late market run up in gas and you want to do adjustment bids, our process here, it's just very cumbersome. Getting the bids built and submit them all. And that's why I think I submitted a proposal probably about a month ago. A much easier solution for the users would be for us just to submit a new gas price and let CalISO generate the new reference level prices based on the gas price that was submitted. Essentially, we would be submitting a gas price request, and the process would be very similar to what they do in New England, ISO New England. You basically send an email to the ISO and say, hey, look, we're facing this certain gas price, and get approval to submit bids using that higher gas price.
On a previous market award, right?
No, this would be, well, that would be ideal, but just taking the current concept right now with adjustment level prices, submitting them day ahead,
current process, it'd be much easier for us, the users, to submit a gas price request as opposed to submitting the full-blown adjustments reference level bids.
Got it. So you're saying, hey, instead of me trying to calculate my total cost, I know my gas price index cost is no longer $5, it's $7.25. So can I just give you the $7.25 and ISO, you do that calculation? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Okay. No, thank you, Alan. I would like to see if there's any reaction from ISO policy or any other ISO SMEs there. I heard a few things that I wrote down. So while you guys think about that, let me go to Kathleen Colbert at Vistra. Good morning, Kathleen. And you may be on double mute.
Can you hear me, Mark? Sorry.
I can. Good morning.
Okay, perfect. Good morning. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Now I just thought I would chime in to share a tad bit of history on one of the points, if that's helpful. And for context, for those who aren't familiar with me, I was one of the policy staff on CCW. So something that Alan just said about submitting the gas commodity price versus, or let's say the gas commodity plus transportation, so a GPI equivalent, to update all of the DEBs or a proxy cost versus actually submitting the all-in cost, was something that was discussed quite fairly extensively in the stakeholder process when CCW was developed. And I think that there's a really important element that can help explain why this was the design choice that was made at the time. The CCW was stakeholdered to apply to all technology types or most technology types, not just to gas prime mover technologies. I believe that change was made either in implementation or in the tariff development. And I apologize, I don't recall. And so I'll lean on other CAISO existing staff who may have a better recollection of exactly when that was changed. But my gut was it was sometime in the tariff development phase or in the FERC proceeding that it went from all resources or most resources. And the reason I'm caveating is commitment cost updates obviously don't apply to non-generator resources. So there are some, caveats in there, but the concept was there could be a reason for an actual cost of a resource, whether it's gas or not, to be different than what the defaults of either the DEB or the proxy costs were. And so the ask at the time was to make this a flexible product, like a flexible tool. And so the CAISO went down the path of using an update to the reference levels as a whole, dollar per megawatt hour, dollar per start, dollar per run hour, because of that kind of discussion that we had with stakeholders during that particular initiative. So I just wanted to add that context because I think it explains, because we did, we benchmarked what New York was doing with all of the gas price updates. We looked extensively at the options, and the big driver was that we wanted to have a tool that could be used to more fully comply with Order 831, which was not limited to gas, but that's not how it's been implemented. So I understand why the conversation is going where it's going. I hope that's helpful.
No, I find that extremely helpful. Thank you, Kathleen. And if any of the ISO policy folks that are on the line now would like to opine on that or weigh in, please raise your hand. I'd be happy to call on you. I think what you stated also, Kathleen, kind of touches on some of the principles around, simplicity and feasibility and taking into account all resource types. So that's good background. But to Alan's point, if I heard him say, hey, if my day ahead awards are locked in at a given cost, and in real time I now need to procure fuel, either additional fuel for those particular hours or all the fuel because maybe it wasn't procured in day ahead. How does a generator represent those costs today? I'm going to go out on a limb and say I believe that's through the energy bid, given those min load and startup costs and things like that are kind of locked in for that hour. Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the automated reference level adjustment process or the manual reference level adjustment process in real time can be applied to day ahead awarded hours. Do you want to correct me there or confirm that?
Yeah, I think that's right, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Kathleen, you shot back up. Thank you. Let's go to Kathleen's line.
No, agree with Katie. That is correct. If you have received a day ahead award, you cannot rebid your commitment costs
Correct.
in real time. It would be worth tracking down if that applies. I think it applies to all binding startup instructions that are received by RUC. But if you don't receive a binding startup, I don't recall if RUC instead of IFM. So it would be worth tracking down that difference and confirming it for the group.
Yeah, that's a good take back.
Katie, you may know that off the top of your head. Do you recall the difference between IFM award commitment versus a RUC binding startup?
Yeah, so the RUC binding startups apply to units that have a cycle time, which is startup and minimum on time of greater than 255 minutes. I believe that to be the case as well, Kathleen, but we can confirm that. Thank you.
That'd be good. And there are real-time rebidding rules that you should cover, because in the instance you don't, like in the instance that you don't have a day ahead award, you can rebid your commitment cost in real time. And those rules are very important for gas management, and everyone should be up to speed with those too.
Absolutely, because at that point in time, the real-time gas price index would be utilized. That gets pulled around 10:30, I think the night before, if I recall correctly. Was there anyone from the ISO policy staff that wanted to weigh in on what we've heard? Or is there anyone else from a stakeholder community perspective that agrees regarding the multi-resource submission, at the fuel zone level makes sense and would really help this process? Again, I haven't heard anyone test the reasonableness thresholds. Alan jumped in and did. Are we saying we think the reasonableness thresholds are sufficiently set? Or are there any other solutions we need to be thinking about as we talk about automated reference level adjustments? All right, thank you, Dwight. Let's go to Dwight's line. You may be muted on your side, Dwight.
Service. And
there you go.
One of the issues, well, I do think that the multi-resource submission at a fuel zone level would be very helpful for us because that's really what kept us from doing the automated reference level change adjustments. It's just there's way too many units that we have, and it's going to be way too time consuming to do that. So that's definitely helpful for us. On the cap, though, one of the problems that we do face is, sometimes, like I said, intraday gas may be too expensive, more than 25% of that. And so what we can end up having is if we are short on gas and we see that the market is exporting a lot of our units in the intraday, in the real-time market through EIM, we might need to raise our fuel price to cover penalties. And those, on SOC days, those penalties might be higher than that cap. And so we, if we do raise our prices, we DEV and that's still not going to get raised, and that can cause issues for us.
Okay, good comment there, Dwight. And I'm gonna ask you a question, and if again, I want everyone to be sensitive of standards of conduct from a bidding strategy perspective and all that other fun stuff. So to the extent I heard you say, hey, due to the amount of resources we have, it's just not feasible for us to utilize the automated reference level adjustment, given that it's currently one at a time. How are those costs then made up? Is that something that gets represented in the energy bid, or you leverage that up to that 25% buffer that's allowed for those proxy units? And that's a question for Dwight. So if you wouldn't mind unmuting his WebEx, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, in those instances, we've mainly just submitted a manual reference level change request to help with that.
Got it. Okay, perfect. And then I heard you state, to the extent you have to ink your units, which may result in kind of going outside of some of those thresholds that were set, or I shouldn't say thresholds, bands that were set from an OFO perspective. I would love to hear from the ISO policy team to the extent that is something that, when we came up with that policy, that we believed should be allowed to be represented. I think of OFO from a gas system reliability perspective, but I'm just a facilitator here, so I would love to hear from the ISO staff on whether or not those were intended to be allowed to be included as, reflecting some of those potential penalties and things like that entities are facing. So Katie, I don't know if that's you. I do see Sylvie on. Don't mean to put you on the spot, Sylvie, but I would love for you guys to weigh in. Katie, you may be on mute on your end if you're talking, or Sylvie, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand.
Yeah, I was just giving Sylvie a chance to raise her hand, but I can sort of, provide a little bit of context. I think, we've been pretty clear in terms of the policy that we implemented and the business practices we've established around the current process that, we don't allow for the OFO related costs to be included in those adjustments submitted to the CAISO, whether those are automated or manual. So those currently in the current practice aren't something that are sort of able to be considered in those avenues.
Got it. Okay, thank you. All right, I saw Michael with his hand shoot up. Michael from Tenasca, go for it, sir. Looks like his WebEx is muted. There we go.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Michael. Go for it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I just wanted to second that, around the timing, having a lot of resources can make this process challenging. I think we've addressed some of that through the automated process and going through that, and have had some success with it. But, it certainly can still be a challenge if you run up against that threshold and need to put in a manual request. That does present some challenges with getting all of that done, submitted and verified by 8 a.m. So that's definitely one challenge that we have. I also wanted to say I do like the idea of submitting a gas price versus a cost per resource. I don't know how feasible it is to do that, to apply it, across the portfolio of resources since there's so many different fuel regions. But if that's possible, I think it would definitely be much more streamlined from the SC's perspective to say, hey, this is the PGE Citygate price that I've got. Apply it to all of these resources. And I think that's all I wanted to add there. Actually, sorry, the RUC is definitely a big challenge if you have long start or extremely long start resources that, based on the gas price and the forecasted LMPs, you're not really expecting it to clear, and then you get very large RUC awards that presents quite a challenge in many cases, especially over the weekends. Like others pointed out, it can be very hard to even get gas, and more than likely it's going to cost a significant amount, and at which point your costs are locked because you're committed in the day ahead. So there's really no action that you could take in that case to say, hey, these are my costs, or even to really reflect it in any way at all.
So Michael, I think I hear you agreeing with what Alan stated earlier, is when you're not anticipating award, energy award, that the gas may or may not be procured, and as a result of getting an award, now you have these other costs that aren't necessarily reflected based on what was grabbed in day ahead. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's accurate, right? You would have a
okay.
unit you're not expecting to run that could burn, several 100,000 MMBTUs over the weekend. If it did run, but based on economics, you're not expecting that. So you avoid nominating the timely package, and then you're exposed to the same day when you get RUC'd every day. And it's really, most of the time, it's almost just pure RUC, right? There's no economic awards outside of, you know, the resource being committed with its commitment times due to the RUC. But, you know, this causes huge swings in volume. You're moving quite a bit of gas there.
Gotcha. Katie, do you mind, at least for the extremely long units, which I believe is greater than 24 hours from a cycle time perspective, is that something that was, you know, previously thought about, and are there any processes in place to potentially update those costs, understanding that you know, if a unit has a minimum on time of, say, I don't know, 28 hours or something crazy like that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michael, for the question. It's something that we sort of worked out. Not sure of the timing. It was definitely post, you know, CCW implementation, but we were finding that we were getting questions from scheduling coordinators with extremely long start resources of how to sort of approach the, you know, the issue of having higher costs than what we're using in our reference level calculations. So I'd point you to the BPM. We do have a section in there that speaks to how extremely long start resources can utilize the reference level change request process. While we may not be able to approve those per se, you know, in the T+2 or D+2 timeline when we would expect those to be submitted, there is the potential that that can serve as sort of a placeholder for aftermarket cost recovery. And so that's sort of one way that we've been able to accommodate those extremely long start resources within the bounds of the functionality we have established.
Okay, thank you, Katie. And maybe what we'll do as a follow-up here is we'll capture some of those references. I know Kathleen sent us a reference as well regarding some of those day-ahead commitment costs. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you weighing in. I heard you agree with Alan regarding some of the, you know, unforeseen commitments, how to reflect those costs, as well as the potential for representing a gas price versus overall costs. So thank you for that. I saw Michelle from LA with her hand go up, so let's go to Michelle next.
Michelle, I just want to go ahead and emphasize that I also agree with what Alan and Michael stated, and it would definitely be a lot easier to put in the dollar per MMBTU on the gas side, especially because the way that CAISO already has the fuel zones is they're tied to the fuel zone could be tied to multiple units. So taking that into consideration might be easier and streamline that cost.
Yeah, so you're saying, you know, because I believe it's a weighted average, right, Katie? So Michelle, are you saying it would just be much simpler if the ability to plug in the gas price that is getting utilized by the entity is much simpler than trying to calculate what those associated overall costs are when we do the 125% adder and things like that?
Correct, because I mean we know exactly how much the pricing is going to be on dollar per MMBTU, and whatever we procure might go to multiple units, whatever that fuel zone is tied to.
Got it. Thank you. I appreciate your feedback there. All right, so I've heard a few entities say that, so I think, you know, that's something we could take back as a group and kind of test that against some of the principles we established as a working group early on to see how that kind of shakes out. Let me go to Darren at Idaho, and then I'm going to go to Kathleen at Vistra again. And Dwight, I see your hand. Michael, I see your hand. Michelle, yours as well. To the extent you still have a comment, go ahead and leave them up, or go ahead and take them down if you guys are good. Appreciate that. All right, let's go to Darren.
Darren put his hand down.
Okay, Darren, did you still have, oh, there it is. Let's go to Darren's line. Thank you, Darren. Good morning.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Excellent. Would like to echo the sentiment. Fuel price would be preferable as far as price per MMBTU. On a bidirectional pipe, this is still problematic using either one of these calculations, whether it be the automated or manual, just due to the timing differential and the pipe being able to change directions and move from a couple different zones. So that fuel price region could potentially change, and there's going to be some slippage there. So it's still concerning for us, not only on weekdays, but really on weekends as well, despite stepping up to the 125 versus the 1.1. So that's my thoughts. I think the solution for IDOPE in this is to get, and I heard Katie say this, a more adaptable or more, I guess, flexible fuel price region to be utilized in these and others, I guess, for calculation. So.
Yeah, and I appreciate that comment, Darren, and maybe Katie, I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. I believe there's, the ability to create a custom fuel region. Do you foresee, or were those intended to kind of capture some of the, I heard Darren say, and I know we're going to talk about it here in a little bit about multiple fuel zones and things like that. Were those kind of intended to capture outside of the norm, gas price reflection?
Yeah, it's a good question. The way that we have the fuel regions designed is that they can really only be tied to one fuel hub currently. So that's sort of a limitation on how we can reflect the cost in those index hubs. We can just tie it to one. I think it's a challenge when we think about the reference level change request process. We have a bit more stringent requirements around submitting, at least for a manual request, submitting that for the fuel price hub that you are assigned to based on that master file mapping. And that's because we have sort of an edge case calculation scenario where if we're receiving a handful of these manual requests from different folks tied to the same fuel region, I think it's 3 or more requests, we say, we'll do a volume weighted average recalculation of the fuel price, and that'll get applied to everybody on that fuel hub, sort of signaling to us that there's movement in the system that we're not capturing in our index costs. And so because we have that option to perform that volume weighted recalculation, that's why we have to be a little bit more strict about the manual request coming in for the associated fuel price, at least based on how we've implemented it today.
Got it. Thank you.
Answer your question.
No, I think that helped me. Absolutely. Thank you. And Darren, I appreciate your comments. And I think that's, I'm hearing a lot of stakeholders coalesce around the reflection of that gas price and MMBTU. So definitely going to be taking that one back and challenging the ISO team there on their thoughts. I see Kathleen. Thank you for your patience, Kathleen. Let's go to Kathleen.
No, no worries at all. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So I just want to talk more about this idea of it being a fuel price or commodity plus transport, so like a GPI equivalent update. And I want to share a slightly different perspective. So Vistra owns both gas assets and storage assets. So when I think about my fleet, I am thinking about both parts of my fleet, both the gas and the storage. And I want to I want to share in this working group space that what makes it challenging for me to be able to buy in and move along with an idea of switching to a gas price approach is that to actually comply with Order 831, it does need to be technology neutral. And the policy was developed to apply to both gas and non-gas resources. And the way that, so what I'm trying to say is that this is the reason this was chosen. And we are exposed and have a need for this long-term to apply to all of our assets. I recognize that it was implemented in a way that the ability to update opportunity costs that are for storage, that's not a part of the current policy. So I'm not talking about current policy right now, but I am flagging a gap. So when I think about the reference level adjustment process, and how we have price formation during times when there are costs that exceed our current caps. There is a gap in our current tariff and our current rules, in my opinion, as someone who owns storage. So just to take the context, right? As somebody who has that type of asset, the fact that we cannot submit a reference level adjustment above 1,000 to reflect that our opportunity cost of operating has changed as all of these other fundamentals have changed, as they have affected the gas assets, they also affect the storage, the opportunity cost of using that storage. Now, for context, CCW was stakeholdered and filed and implemented prior to there being a storage default energy bid, which I think is a critical piece to remember, right? So when we were going through this, the idea of how it applied to storage was not fully developed. And so I do think that discussions about the non-gas ability or eligibility to reflect cost-based verified offers above 1,000 is something we need to revisit in our overall market design from a price formation perspective. So I know that this group is gas management, which is why you're hearing the gas perspective. So I want to flesh this out and share the price formation perspective from a holistic market where there are multiple types and we have a diverse fleet. And so I just wanted to put that on the table, Mark and Katie, for you to take that back to the CAISO. That's really what needs to be balanced, and what was balanced during the stakeholder process is it's not just a gas issue. There's also gas equivalent costs, so fuel equivalent cost, and for assets with an opportunity cost, the decision at the time was that the commitment cost enhancements phase 3 opportunity costs would be sufficient, and they would allow for the DEBs to go above 1,000. But in practice, when we implemented the storage DEB, that process is not what storage is using. So I hope this is making some sense, is that some of the assumptions made at the time haven't borne out, and we need more of a holistic review on the CCW functionality, not just focused on gas. And so when you bring in those stakeholders, I think you'll hear other perspectives. Now, I think you could implement it in a way that you can appease both the non-gas and the gas. So maybe it's an opportunity cost adder update and a fuel price update, but you'd have to provide multiple mechanisms for the right components to be updated if you're going to move away from the more of the neutral technology solution.
No, very well stated, Kathleen. And I think that is something that the ISO team is already starting to think about. At least that's kind of what I've heard through some of those internal policy-related discussions. So I really appreciate that background and great perspective there as to why it is the way it is today from a CCW perspective, and then starting to kind of think about some of the interplay as the grid changes from an overall technology perspective. So I appreciate that.
Of course, and yeah, and we're open to changes and moving to more of a component update. So I want to be clear, I'm supportive of y'all going in that direction. Just please remember there's both gas and non-gas that are going to need in the future to have some solutions provided.
Excellent. Good stuff. All right. So if I were to kind of briefly recap what we've heard so far before we move on to manual reference level adjustments is, yes, there's absolutely support for a multi-resource submission at the fuel zone. We heard a few entities say they would utilize this more often based on the size of their fleet. I also heard, or an ask or request for the ISO to potentially explore a means of allowing stakeholders to represent that actual cost they're facing at whether it's MMBTU, and then we've got to keep in mind other technology types and things like that. So we'll absolutely take that back and kind of test that against some of the principles and see if that's something we want to explore. So I appreciate everyone's feedback on this. I heard a little bit that the reasonableness thresholds were too restrictive, especially heading into that weekend over a few days, given that there may be more than that 25% threshold. So I appreciate the feedback on that, and I definitely look forward to seeing what type of data we could come up with to kind of support that. So appreciate everyone's feedback on that. I think we're good to move to the next slide. Let's kind of tee up problem statement number 7, if you don't mind, which is a few slides ahead. And then again, I'm going to, back one more. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So just like I asked on the automated reference level adjustment slide, you know, start thinking about some of the scenarios the team faces. What's wrong with the current I shouldn't say what's wrong. Where does the current implementation have opportunity for improvement, and really start thinking about some of the solutions that the community would need to see to kind of get over some of these hurdles, right? So the current problem statement is stakeholders may not have actual gas cost information necessary to submit a manual reference level change request by that 8 a.m. deadline. The existing process, I'm going to cover it at a really high level, then I'm going to hand it over to Katie to let her walk through some of that education again like we did previously. You know, the manual reference level change requests are submitted via city by 8 a.m. That 8 a.m. deadline is intended to provide enough time to review those requests and update those values for the market systems prior to the associated market close. So not only allowing time for the ISO staff to make those changes, confirm those changes are valid, and then allow time for the stakeholder to represent those costs in cyber. And then, you know, supporting documentation must be justifiable as an increase to the expected fuel or fuel equivalent costs. There was a data request per this working group to see how many manual reference level change requests have there been. I can report that data request went pretty quick, and there was only one submitted to date in 2023. So I'd really like to tease out, after we get through this education portion, why that is. Why does that? Because, you know, at a high level as a facilitator, when I see that, I tend to think, well, maybe the automated reference level change request process is working and those thresholds suffice. So really want to challenge the audience on that. And then before we turn it over is, you know, the potential solution we heard is to extend that manual reference level change request deadline past 8 a.m. You know, that was discussed a few working groups ago. In those conversations, you know, it's what are those trade-offs? How close can we push that deadline? So I would like to hear not only from Katie, because I know it's her team that kind of processes those requests, but also hear from the stakeholders, you know, how soon or what is the latest point in time that you would like to see those costs reflected in cyber so that you can go off and do your associated calculation for formulating a strategy prior to submitting those bids in day ahead. So think about more solutions as we walk through this education piece. I'm going to turn it over to Katie and look forward to the discussion on solutions. Thank you, Katie.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, for teeing that up. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right, just a little bit of information here about the manual process. So I think we've sort of touched on it a little bit in our conversation already, but let's just kind of set the stage here again. So another one of the options that scheduling coordinators have to request updates to the reference levels that we use in the market. So, you know, I think ideally the manual process was sort of designed, like I had mentioned in answering Emmy's question, you know, if you're seeing that your costs would force those revised reference levels up past what the threshold might be, you know, that would be a good scenario in which the manual reference level change request process could be used if you think that those automated adjustments might get capped at the threshold. But again, you know, this is available at any time to the scheduling coordinators, provided the documentation and the other requirements are submitted. And so what this entails is that the scheduling coordinator will submit a ticket via city, an inquiry ticket. That needs to be received by 8 a.m. Pacific time on the day of the applicable market execution. So like I said, for tomorrow's day ahead, for 12/8 day ahead, we need to receive that by 8 a.m. this morning. For 12/7 real time, we would also need to receive that by this morning. The 8 a.m. cutoff time is sort of a balance between a couple different system and manual processes we have to run. So that's really to, you know, first give our team enough time to review these tickets that come in, review the supporting documentation, check things on our side, and give the downstream systems enough time to sort of recalculate those values. They have to go through a couple different internal steps before they reach CMRI, where they're published. You know, the revised values, if accepted, would be published out to the customer results interface in CMRI, and that would, you know, be intended to be published with enough time to give the scheduling coordinators some flexibility to go back into Cyber, into the bidding platform, and revise their bids accordingly. So it's sort of a balance between a couple different moving pieces, and that's sort of where we landed for that 8 a.m. cutoff time when we first implemented the functionality. So that ticket, I'll go into some specifics on what we would look for in that ticket, but of course, one of the major components would be the price that you're requesting. For the gas price, we would look to see that that's at least 10% higher and 50 cents greater than what we're using in our calculations. If it's lower than that, you know, we would generally expect that the automated process with that reasonableness threshold would be generally sufficient to cover that sort of smaller swings in price. So if we approve the value, we'll communicate that out via city on the ticket. We'll take that price and we'll recalculate the reference levels with that approved fuel price. Let's go to the next slide, please.
Hey, Katie, real quick, what is the associated timing, you know, once it's approved in city from a process perspective until that cost is reflected in Cyber? Or are you saying the team doesn't update the city ticket until you've kind of already processed it, so at that point in time, once that notification is received, that price should be reflected?
Yeah, good question. We generally endeavor to provide an update on the ticket as soon as we can, especially if that's going to be approved. We want to let the folks know about that, and so we'll try to update the scheduling coordinator via city in a timely manner. Get back to them hopefully soon after the ticket is, you know, processed and reviewed. And then, you know, ideally we're getting those recalculated values posted out to CMRI, at least for the day ahead time frame of, you know, approximately 9 a.m., 9 to 9:15. Yeah, so
okay,
trying to give some time before the market close at 10 a.m. in the day ahead time frame.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. So a little bit more information about what we would expect in the city ticket. And again, I'll say this is all covered in great detail in the Market Instruments BPM, so please refer to that resource if you'd like more information on this. But the ticket comes in via city. It's an inquiry ticket. There's a special sort of shadow box we designed called the manual reference level change request box. That needs to be checked, and what that does is really routes the ticket directly to our team to review it as quick as possible. And so we would expect that would be checked, and then the ticket would include the following information I have listed here. So trade date, applicable markets, resource ID or IDs. You can submit multiple resources in the same manual request ticket as long as it's clear enough to us, you know, which resource is being requested for which associated fuel price if there's multiple. Of course, we need to see the requested fuel price, the associated volume for, you know, if you're submitting the gas price, we would need an associated volume in MMBTU, the pricing location of the requested cost, and then another critical piece, which is the supporting documentation. So what's really showing us that gas price is changing. So whether that's an invoice, a quote, maybe a screenshot of your trading activity, something that shows us that price is you know, incurred or expected to be incurred through the request. Go to the next slide. Okay, similar numerical example I've put together here. You know, again, for the min load cost, say we have a default min load cost of 5,000. We've calculated the reasonableness threshold min load at 6,500. If we remember that scenario 2 that I covered in the automated, say the scheduling coordinator went in to adjust their min load bid at 7,000, but they got capped at the reasonableness threshold. So of course that would flow through like we described. Say instead the scheduling coordinator chooses to submit a manual request. Maybe the underlying gas price is $10, whereas we were using a $5 gas price. Whatever that may be, that results in a min load expected cost of $7,000 per hour. The scheduling coordinator would submit the underlying gas price to us via city. If we approve that, we would recalculate their min load cost at $7,000. Now the scheduling coordinator can submit their min load bids up to $7,000 in the bidding platform. I'll pause here and see if there's any questions, comments on this material.
Thank you, Katie. All right, so from the audience, either press #2 if you're only on audio, or feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions pertaining to the educational piece of this. We will start talking about solutions here shortly. So let's pause for a sec, see if there's any questions. All right, not seeing any, Katie, so go for it.
All right, thanks. And then one more quick slide just to round this out here. Go to the next one. Perfect, thanks. So just a quick sort of note on aftermarket cost recovery. We've mentioned this a couple of times now on the call. But generally, we have established a process by which scheduling coordinators or resources who have submitted those reference level change requests, whether it's automated or manual, they may be eligible for aftermarket cost recovery under certain criteria. And, we've designed this to be a little bit more, have a little bit more kind of bounds around what can and can't be requested, really sort of intending for this not to be a catch-all cost recovery mechanism, but really focused on recovering costs that may not have been included in or reflected in those, either of those automated or manual requests. So again, BPM, lots of details, great resource there. What I'll say here at high level, if you've submitted an automated request that gets capped at that reasonableness threshold, that might be a scenario that we could process aftermarket cost recovery. If a manual request was not approved prior to the close of the bidding window, if we weren't able to approve that for a variety of reasons, as long as it was considered quote unquote valid, if it met the criteria, if it came in by 8 o'clock and had supporting documentation, and we weren't able to get to it for some reason, that might also be a scenario that would be eligible for cost recovery. So there's a process to go about submitting those requests. Essentially, it starts with a city ticket with that aftermarket request and any sort of supporting documentation and narrative around that. That needs to be submitted within 30 business days of the trade date in question. We have a process to review that. We may go back and forth, ask some questions, and sort of get a sense of what the request is. If we approve it, then we will modify those reference levels using that revised fuel cost in the settlement system. And that would eventually get reflected in your settlement statement further down the line. I think that's all I have for cost recovery. So unless there's any questions on this, I will turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Katie. I have a question just to make sure everyone in the audience is on the same page. For the automated, so looking at the first 2 criteria there to be eligible, that is an and statement between those 2, essentially, right? Both have to have had to be requested in order to qualify for this process?
I would say no, not necessarily.
Okay. Okay, good.
I think if you were just leveraging the automated tool and you found yourself capped, that could be a valid scenario. On the other side, if the manual request was just processed and the automated wasn't used, that could also be feasible.
Okay, that's a fantastic clarification. Perfect, thank you. All right, so at this time, Kathleen, let me see if the question, I'm going to call on Kathleen and see if it's related to education before I let Katie go.
Education
or if
question.
I need to. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I just have something that I would be helpful to understand better is on the timing. It actually is more on the 8 o'clock cutoff. I was just waiting to see if for the end. That's all right. If I could go back to your 8 o'clock a.m. deadline. Katie, do you still look at the gas prices and if the price change? So I guess my question is, I'm trying to remember the process by which the gas indices move significantly and we reopen the market, the cyber submissions. So I thought that was day ahead, but I may be getting confused. So can you help walk through that scenario if you guys are still doing that step?
Yeah. Katie, did you want to jump in there, or I can? It's up to you.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, thanks, Kathleen. That's a good question. I actually don't recall off the top of my head. I know that was a process at some point, and I just don't want to commit to something without, I just can't remember off the top of my head. So Mark, if you want to jump in, that's also something we can take back and
yeah, we can absolutely take it back and follow up. I'm looking to see if Guillermo or Abhishek is on the line. But my understanding, Kathleen, is that functionality was sunsetted with CCW, where we used to have those scalers of if it went above 175%, we would essentially send out a notice to the entire market, inform them that we're reopening the market. We just went and grabbed the associated updated gas costs and then resubmit your bids accordingly. That was sunsetted with CCW.
Cool. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, I was just trying to think through if it wasn't sunsetted, if there would be an opportunity to like have a later
utilize that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but appreciate the answer. Thanks.
No problem. All right.
One thing I'll add, just kind of alongside that, and what I mentioned, Kathleen, about the sort of volume-weighted average recalculation we process. If we do get and it's not related to holding the market open or extending the timeline, but, if we do get a handful, like 3 or more manual requests for the same fuel price hub, we do perform sort of a recalculation of that fuel price, and that hits all of the resources that are associated to that hub. And so I think that's one of the ways in which we try to sort of take into account whether there's movement in the market that scheduling coordinators are seeing that somehow we haven't reflected in our system. So not really related to the timing of the market, but just sort of an aside there.
No, that's extremely good information there, Katie. When the team performs that, to the extent they get enough requests and they say, hey, we now need to update that GPI, how are folks notified of that? Do we post a market notice, a M&S? Is there proactive outreach? I'm just curious how a stakeholder would know, to the extent they weren't one of those individuals that submitted the request, but it does impact them.
Yeah, good question. I don't believe we have a process to post a market notice.
Okay.
Again, it's sort of the manual process, like you alluded to,
right.
Hasn't been leveraged as frequently. We haven't really, it's not something we run into very often. So that's not really something that's part of the process currently.
Okay. No, that's good to know. I captured that here as potential follow-up. And it looks like Kathleen has a question regarding where in the BPM. So I think that's a good follow-up item there that we can make sure that's reflected accordingly, Kathleen. Let's jump back to slide 12 and start kind of diving into some solutions here as you guys were kind of starting to think about some of the scenarios in which you would want to leverage this. Again, as you see, we only saw one of those to date for 2023. The previously communicated potential solution was, potentially extend that current manual reference level change request deadline. As we just heard from Katie, right now that processing takes up until 9/9/15 to reflect those updated costs. So I guess a question for the audience is how much time do you need to get those updated costs, formulate your associated strategies, and reflect those costs in the market? So that's the first question I would like to pose to the group. And then the second thing that, just kind of trying to do a memory hook here based on previous discussion, and this is all captured in the discussion paper that we have posted out on the website, is That 8 a.m. deadline, we heard some stakeholders note that that kind of coincides with the intraday 1 nomination deadline. And then we also heard that some of the information is simply not yet known at that time that's required as part of that manual reference level submittal. So Isabella, if you wouldn't mind jumping down to slide 14, I believe it was slide 14, I made a note here, hopefully I had that right, where we outline some of the requirements. Here we go, perfect, this is it. So this is what is getting kind of required in that city ticket submission. So what's not yet known as part of that submission would be my second question to the audience to kind of help us start really thinking about solutions. So if you guys have any comments, please raise your hand. I'd be happy to call on you. I saw Kathleen's hand shoot up. Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. It's very similar. So I'll use the commodity price. Other folks, please, afterwards, give other examples if you would like, but I'll just focus on that because it's simple to understand. So at 8 a.m., the gas markets are still trading. So you're still seeing the gas price evolve. It is actually the same issue that that the CAISO has, right? So the CAISO team sees the gas market still trading and has procedures for pulling the weighted average at that point in time that it is needed for the systems to be able to calculate these DEBs and proxy costs. Now, the timeline needed for cyber is different than what is needed for the DEB, and I believe the cutoff, unless it's changed, was 8:30 a.m. So I think both us as a market participant and CAISO staff who's looking at ICE trading at that time between 8 and 8:30, we're seeing similar things, right? We're seeing the market changing and evolving as bids and offers clear, and so is CAISO staff. So the point in time that you pull the GPI or you pull the ICE index to use for the day ahead, that is a technical limitation that it is needed by 8:30 a.m. in order to be sent to ECIC so that the DEB can be calculated. So I bring that up because you're hearing lots of folks say we'd like to submit a gas price. Part of the reason that a gas price was a little bit more challenging is that there are times that the energy cost index calculator actually runs. So there are limitations from an IT perspective that just makes it a bit more rigid than if you're submitting like a bid. So cyber is a bit more flexible, right? So that's another reason that the choice to use bids was done at the time. From an implementation perspective, we got that feedback from the team. But I bring this up because the latest I could see this ever moving is 8:30, but I would ask you to consider 8:30 so that both.
Okay, I was just going to ask you that. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. So you're saying, hey, well, so 8:30, but at 8:30, the associated price needs to be reflected. Okay, so I hear Kathleen saying 8:30.
You hear me saying 8:30 is the absolute latest,
right?
Based on technical limitations, but it is later than you're giving us, and it would be nice to be consistent so that both the CAISO and market participants are using the same time.
Got it. I would be interested to hear from the rest of the stakeholder community if they agree 8:30, that extra half hour would buy the community the time they needed. Or would that extra half hour give you the opportunity to get some of the supporting documentation that's required here to actually make that request? Is anyone opposed to 8:30, or if you agree, maybe give me the thumbs up if that's possible on the WebEx, just so I can kind of get a poll from the audience. I didn't have a little poll ready. I should have. That's on me as the facilitator. And we always have opportunity. Oh, I see Dwight. Thank you, Dwight. Let's go to Dwight from Arizona.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I just want to point out, so we don't participate in the day-ahead market. We're just solely EIM participants. And so really, we don't know how much we're going to export within the EIM market. So at 8 a.m., the gas day is barely ending for the previous day, and we're just starting a new day. So we're having to predict how much we're going to be swung in the EIM market. And, at times, that can be, 60, quite a bit of gas. And, we might be trading through ID3. So for us, the later that you guys can do it, the better, because 8 a.m. is, we have to make quite a bit of assumptions here.
Yeah, and I think, and Katie, I'm going to ask you, and I think that's a good point, Darren, what is the real-time manual reference level threshold deadline? I missed that on the slide. Do you want to educate us again on that real quick?
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Dwight, for the question. The deadline is the same for the real-time market as well. So it would be 8 a.m. on the day of. Okay. Yeah. So if we're talking about real-time December 7, that would be by 8 a.m. today. Okay. Acknowledging the fact that by 8 a.m. we've already passed about 7 or 8 hours in the trading day. That's where the automated tool could be helpful to be used for those hours prior to 8 a.m. So that's sort of one of the constraints we have is because it's a manual process. We're sort of forced to keep it in the same time frame realm as we've established for the day ahead as well. So yeah, 8 a.m. to answer your question for real time.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. And I heard Dwight say, it'd be great to have any additional time there to try to reflect potentially those updated costs. I'm curious. So again, looking at the data, we saw one for this year. Why is that? Do we simply not see a need to execute the manual reference level requests this year because those were captured in the automated reference level adjustments, or are there any other reasons out there that haven't been brought to this form outside of other activities happening before that 8 a.m. deadline that we want to make sure we really think about as a group? Kathleen, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to make an ask for something on the solution space. This is Kathleen from Vistra. So part of what was originally contemplated, which I understand is not implemented, but would be great to have implemented. So if we could put this in the solution spaces for any reference level adjustment that had a level. So if we look at the scenario 2, so you submit a reference level adjustment and you want it to be subject to the reasonableness threshold, be ex ante verified. I mean, we want that because we want price formation to be better, right? So we want them to be able to submit it and be verified.
You're talking about day ahead, Kathleen? Just I want to make sure I'm tracking.
Oh, real time. Yeah,
okay,
I thought
real
we
time.
were only talking about day ahead before, but now that we're talking about real time.
Okay, so real time, 8 a.m., you're saying execute the automated to test those reasonableness thresholds. Keep going.
I'm throwing out 8 a.m. because from submitting the reference level, you should be able to do that at any time before T minus 75, right? So let's say we're after intraday 3. So you get in before hour ending, let's say 21. So hour ending 21 is when you're trying to show change. You get into the market, you submit the reference level adjustment. In your chart, in your slide that has the scenarios, it's probably easier to talk through it. If your reference level change request is higher than the reasonableness threshold, today you're capped at that reasonableness threshold. But what was contemplated and originally promised to stakeholders through the final proposal was that the amounts above the reasonableness threshold would then be verified after the fact, and then after the fact review with CAISO, and if verified, be compensated through bid cost recovery. So what I would add on the solution space is to do that.
Okay, so let's go to slide 15, Isabella, because I want to make sure everyone's tracking with Kathleen on the scenarios there. For So Kathleen, I heard you say, hey, as part of that manual or the manual cost recovery, to the extent that threshold was binding, we already received that manual reference level change request via city ticket. If we know it was capped because of those thresholds, then the ask from a solution space is to see that it was capped, understand that there was additional costs not potentially not fully recovered in the market, and if that's the case, update the associated underlying costs in that overall BCR formulation.
With the tiny nuance that I'm talking about the ex ante, so there's no city ticket, right? You submit your ex ante request, you're capped.
Oh, okay, the automated. Okay, yep.
So if you look at the slide, which you still can't see, I think it was like 7,000. Yes.
Yeah, let's go to the next. Let's go to that next slide so we can tee it up here. Here we go. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so scenario 2, you submit $7,000 per hour. You're capped at $6,500. There's a $500 that wasn't reflected in the market run, but that you have submitted through a cost-based bid was your actual cost or expected cost at the time with the best information you had at that time. So what I propose as a solution to consider is that the $500 be eligible for bid cost recovery after the fact if it can be supported through that after the fact cost review. And there's supporting documentation on the manual that's the same supporting documentation that you would ask for in the after the fact cost review. That would make the market participant then whole to their expected costs that were submitted at the time.
Got it. I follow. Yeah, Katie, jump in, please. I was just about to call on you.
Sure, yeah. So when we're talking about the automated in this scenario too, where the bid is capped at the reasonableness threshold, that is an eligible scenario for aftermarket cost recovery, ex post market to be considered. So that is something we have as an option in the process currently.
Do you feel like there's confusion then? Is the step involved in triggering that after the fact cost review a submission that you would submit the same city ticket for what's the process look like then? Because I do think there might be some confusion on this point. So if you can explain it a little bit further, that would be helpful. So if we're at the end of a trade day and we see through CMRI our results were limited like this, is it submitting a city ticket? Can you unpack the process?
Sure. Yeah, sure. And I think if we go to the next slide, slide 16, yeah. So if, in this scenario, we've gone through, the scheduling coordinator has submitted their automated adjustments, they've gotten capped at that reasonableness threshold, and there's still costs above that threshold that they, are unrecovered. At that point, there's another city ticket that comes into play. That's the aftermarket city ticket. So if they're seeing that and that gets capped, they'll submit that city ticket to us. It doesn't have to come in right away. That can, we give like a 30 business day window from that trading date that they can submit that aftermarket ticket to us. So that would come in as a request with some supporting documentation. There's criteria that we would look at from our end. Of course, we need to make sure that those automated adjustments were capped at the threshold. There's a couple other criteria that we outline in the BPM that get considered. But that would be sort of the process there if we're just talking about the automated request getting capped.
That's really helpful. Yeah, I feel like I have heard folks say that you're only doing that for the manual, so it might so this education is super helpful. I'll defer back to the team, but then I think an 8 a.m. deadline on real time is just fine.
Understanding that the automated piece kind of has you covered from an after the fact perspective. I saw Alan shoot his hand up. Thank you, Kathleen. I really appreciate your engagement today. Let's go to Alan's line, please.
Hey guys, just a comment there on Kathleen's example. I think one clarification on the example is if you're awarded day ahead, then it's the MLC, you wouldn't be able to adjust the MLC with adjusted bids even after market, correct?
Because it's a
Is
day
it
ahead
clear
awarded
day ahead?
hour.
Day ahead or
Right.
even rooked day ahead. So I
Right.
guess with her example, it would have to be clear that there was no award for that hour day ahead or no rucks, and you were kept online for additional hours, in which case then you could go the aftermarket cost recovery process. Am I correct? The example?
Katie?
Yeah, I need to come back through the BPM. There are sort of some nuances that come into play when we're talking about binding day ahead commitments carrying into real time. There's some nuance around that I know we speak to in the BPM. It's not coming to me off the top of my head, but that is sort of something that we have to contemplate and think through when we're thinking about this aftermarket recovery and how to process it.
And that said, referring back to the manual process, if you could extend the real time a little bit longer, perhaps an hour longer, that might be helpful because sometimes same day gas doesn't start trading until after the next day gas is already has traded its volumes. So sometimes we see same day gas maybe trade, probably around 9-10 o'clock Houston time, Central time. So maybe extending the real time process there might work. And I have had some success I did do one manual reference level real time bid submittal this year. So maybe that was me back in November, and it was
Winner,
approved.
winner,
So
chicken
thank you
dinner.
for that.
Yeah.
But because I think, the manual process, if you can get it submitted, makes it easier than doing adjusted bids. And so.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that feedback. So I've heard, hey, 8:30 makes sense, understanding some of the technical feasibility behind it from a day ahead perspective. And then I heard you just say, Alan, maybe because of some of those trading activities are happening and to not get your manual reference level change request deadline, give a little bit more time for real time to allow that processing. I hear that. I'm making notes of that, and I think that's something we can definitely talk about internally. I can ask the internal teams to talk about. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Dwight, did you still have a comment? I see your hand up, and I want to make sure I acknowledge that, or was that just left over from previous comments, sir? Event producer, can we unmute Dwight's hand, please?
Thank you. Yes, I do have another comment. Appreciate that.
Please.
So in this kind of in regards to the manual request, when submitting it, we did submit quite a few of them in 2022. And one of the issues that we did have was that, at times when there's congestion on the pipelines, we might not be able to procure gas at the pricing location that the resource is assigned to. And so now we're required to buy delivered gas or at another location. Some of our units can even blend out through another pipeline. And when we purchase gas at those different locations, we can't show that price and say this is the price, because we were expected to submit at that reference location. And so that creates a problem for us because now we're stuck trying to submit a price that isn't what you're asking for. And then so to us, we would need to be able to change our reference location on a given day.
So that is the next problem statement that I think we're getting to.
Okay.
So I'm going to hold that. I think that's a fantastic scenario, Dwight, that I'm going to pick on you again to kind of frame up and help me understand what that looks like exactly. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So coming back to you here shortly. Are there any other comments? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. I think maybe Dwight just acknowledged it. Thank you. Are there any other comments on the manual reference level change requests in terms of solutioning outside of those associated deadlines that we just talked about? And then Alan, if you have your hand up. Oh, I see Andrew. Let's go to Andrew. Or go ahead, Alan. I think you were unmuted first. Maybe it was just an old hand. I'm going to assume it was. Can we go back to Andrew's line? Andrew, do you mind raising your hand again so we can call on you? Thank you.
Again, Andrew Husted from Idaho Power, and maybe I'm missing the boat here again. This whole process is somewhat new to me, and I'm learning as we go. But I guess I don't understand the mitigation process. I mean, I understand that, of course, you need to understand and try and mitigate people from gaming the market. But, can you guys actively monitor, bids and offers on ICE to sort of either, number one, recalculate and calculate our debt price on the fly? Especially, I think one of the recommendations was, if we say, okay, gas prices have gone from $5 to $100 in one day, that obviously trips the debt calculation. We get mitigated. Number one, can you guys recalculate our DEB on the fly, either from the prices we're submitting or from the prices, trading on ICE? And then number two, I guess I don't understand the mitigation process to say, okay, we're saying we have a gas price at $100, and you're saying, well, our DEB's at $7, for example. Can you just flag, our bid for, a potential mitigation? Let the bids roll through, and then sometime after the fact, you go in and say, your bid was flagged for being mitigated, and sometime down the road, whether that's a day or a number of days after, you have to show supporting documentations. Because I think, to your point, you did say, if there is an event like that happens where gas prices rise suddenly, then you'll be receiving a lot of manual requests, at which point you guys would understand, okay, well, nobody was trying to game the system. Everybody was in the same boat, and it sounds like a lot of work on both parties' processes, yours and the bidders, to try and, meet these deadlines in a real-time manner. When, if either one, CAISO had more information and insight as to what the market was doing, you guys would see these gas prices rising. Number two, once you saw everybody's real-time requests, or I'm sorry, once you saw everybody's manual request changes, you would understand, that no bids needed to be mitigated in that situation. So, again, I'm learning, so, maybe you can...
No, I think those are all good questions that we haven't necessarily went down in today's discussion. Katie, let me first turn to you. I heard a few questions from Andrew. One around flagging for bid mitigations. I know we haven't necessarily talked about bid mitigation and what that process looks like in this working group. Maybe talk a little bit about when the team receives a manual reference level change request, in that supporting documentation, what are you comparing that to, if you can opine on that? And then maybe I'll see policy, if policy has any thoughts on this as well. So let me go to Katie first.
Sure. Thanks, Andy, for the question. I guess a couple of thoughts to share here. And Mark, let me know if I'm straying off topic or if I'm hitting those points you outlined. So I guess to the extent, that the gas market volatility is being reflected in those index prices, we do, capture that in the standard calculations to some extent, right? So if we're talking about the real-time market, we're calculating those reference levels the evening prior to the real-time trading day. What we do is we'll take, up to 3 different vendors that we have to provide those index prices. we'll take those, we'll take an average of those. So, to the extent that that volatility is reflected in those index prices, that makes its way into the calculations already. And so, that's one way we sort of reflect it. Of course, the reference level change request processes exist if there's movement outside of what we are able to capture. And that's sort of what we've outlined in this education section. And then, sort of to the point that I was speaking to with Kathleen's comment, in that manual process, if we are seeing a lot of those requests come in, we do have the capability to sort of recalculate the gas price and the reasonableness thresholds across the entities that are tied to that gas price. So I think there are some tools, that's sort of the purpose of implementing some of these tools and why we have the processes set up how we do to try and capture that volatility. I think getting into mitigation is a little bit trickier. There's a whole sort of other process, the local market power mitigation process that determines mitigation. And again, that's only really for the default energy bids, right? So, if you're mitigated in energy, you're either mitigated to your DEB or to the competitive LMP. You're still sort of stuck with an issue of your commitment cost. If the price is high, you still have that 125% cap on your commitment cost bidding. So I don't know if any of that was helpful, just sort of some thoughts that came to mind. Mark, let me know if I hit the points you were thinking of.
Yeah, no, you definitely did for me. Hopefully, Andrew, that helped. So I appreciate that. All right, are there, again, outside of the associated timelines that I mentioned earlier, is there anything else that the group should be thinking about from a solutioning perspective pertaining specifically to that manual reference level change request process? All right, not hearing any. Great conversation so far. Hopefully that helped, Andrew. Not seeing any other hands, and thank you, Katie, for weighing in there. Appreciate your expertise. Let's go ahead and jump to the next problem statement. All right, so Darren, this is where I'm gonna tee you up. Katie, did you have education slides on this? I don't recall.
I do have a couple, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'll wait a little bit then before we start diving into solutions. So this, and Idaho has made it clear in their public comments, as well as a few others within the CAISO BA. I know a few that have already spoke today have faced this, so it'd be interesting to hear from them as well. But when purchasing gas from a fuel hub that is different from their master file defined fuel hub, generators are unable to dynamically reflect accurate costs from the different fuel hub in the market, right? So the existing process, pre-established fuel regions can be updated via master file, which takes approximately 10 business days, right? The associated solution that was discussed and kind of kicked around in the past through this working group was provide the ability for resources to reflect those costs of their fuel source in a timely manner, right? So, understanding that some circumstances change, you may not know until 2 days prior that you now have a different fuel source. Those costs need to be reflected. How do we accomplish that? And then the potential solution that was kicked around is allow for that more timely update. So definitely going to be, asking the audience to kind of tease back out or to bring back up those scenarios so we can kind of walk through them from a solution perspective. But before we do that, let me go to Katie to walk through those few educational related slides, and then I'm going to ask Darren raise his hand again, and let's have that conversation. So let me pass it off to you first, Katie.
Sure, thanks. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so just wanted to provide a little bit of sort of foundational information of what we mean when we talk about the fuel region price, how that's sort of composed, what are the different elements, and how scheduling coordinators might be able to customize those to their specific resource and where they're situated in the gas system. So in general, the fuel region price, it's something we calculate daily per market. I don't have the timing slide on here. I had it on my last presentation a couple of months ago. But generally we're calculating that for the real-time market and for the day-ahead market. The fuel region price is composed of two components. The first is the natural gas hub index price. So that's updated daily for the day ahead. We'll take the price that's trading on the Intercontinental Exchange between 8 and 9 a.m. We'll pull that price, that gets used in the calculation. For the real-time market, as I mentioned, we have a couple different vendors that we take those prices, we take an average, and that's what gets used for the real-time. So that gets updated daily per market. We also include what we call transportation costs. These are updated a little less frequently. We have a process that updates these approximately monthly. So these are for each specific fuel region, incorporating any sort of marginal transportation rates that are set by the pipeline, fuel reimbursement rate adjustments, any sort of miscellaneous costs like taxes. Those are all sort of built into each specific fuel region, that we've established, and we'll update those generally on a monthly basis. So both of those components get added together to comprise the fuel region price. That summed component goes into the calculation of the reference levels of the DEBs and the commitment costs. As we've sort of mentioned, the fuel regions, really how they're designed now is to utilize one gas pricing hub. Let's go to the next slide, please. So fuel region mapping. So each resource will, in the master file, have a fuel region mapped to their resource ID. And any changes, like Mark mentioned, to the fuel region, that will follow the typical master file update process that takes approximately 10 business days. Scheduling coordinators can opt to use an established fuel region within their BAA. So we have, at this link I've provided here, we have a list of all of the existing fuel regions. There's, I think at this point, well over 100 different custom fuel regions, many per BAA. And so those are options that scheduling coordinators can use, or we give them the option to create their own custom fuel region depending on their specific costs that they're exposed to. And so there's a process. We have submit a city ticket to us, and we can work with you to design that custom fuel region. We do have scheduling coordinators make this as an active election in the master file. So that has to be something that's requested. Otherwise, we'll use what we call the default or the generic fuel region. And what that is essentially for each BAA, we take the minimum of all of the calculated custom fuel regions per trade date per market, and that's what sets the generic region. So if the election isn't made, that's something we default to. So it's definitely helpful for the scheduling coordinators to review their parameters and make sure that that fuel region is accurately reflecting the costs that they're exposed to. Let's go to the next slide.
Katie, maybe before we move on, I do see a hand up from Kathleen, and I just want to make sure we answer her educational related question. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Yeah, it's on the last slide, I think. Maybe 2 behind. No, it's the next one. I apologize. Slide 18. Great. Yes, I have a question, Katie. The last bullet raised a little Spidey thing for me, because the flexibility to request a fuel region, right? So that you're talking through, you can submit to the CAISO that you need a new fuel region needs to be added to the suite. That actually does allow, so from a policy perspective, to utilize more than one gas price. So this functionality, and I hear you saying that you didn't do that. So my educational question is just to walk us from the policy that set up this process to what decision was made to restrict it in your process to one gas price hub. And the way I'm asking the question might be awkward, but it's because I'm trying to highlight that the actual proposal that discussed this, for context for the group, for EIM, was really driven by a lot of EIM entities. So a lot of EIM entities were very vocal about how their locations especially I'll use the desert Southwest, is really complicated. And so there are different times that you might be able to source from different hubs, but also flow or nominate on different pipelines. So this was stakeholdered quite a bit ago in the early EIM days. And so in bidding rules enhancements, the CAISO decided that specifically to address that problem statement that was discussed at length about the need to have multiple hubs and the need to have potentially multiple pipelines under the concept that CAISO systems can only have one GPI, that what the CAISO would do is allow you to come and request basically a blended gas price index. I think we called it a combined gas price index, but the way that it was decided to be implemented was that it would be a combined price or rate that is weighted by the percent of the volumetric usage shipped by each company in the prior month for the pipeline, if available, and averaged to represent a reasonable estimate of resource-specific costs. So we anticipated it would be fairly static, and so it would be all right to set these up. And initially, CAISO committed to doing it on an annual basis. Katie's in the group that implements this, so it's clear to me that over the time from when it was originally set up to be able to ask for a fuel region in like 2017, it seems like the practice has evolved to limit this blended fuel region request that would, and I really appreciate the education on why.
Sure. Thanks, Kathleen, for the question. And I can't really, and you know, I hear you mentioning BREB, previous policy initiative. I really can't speak, unfortunately, to the policy sort of development and intent there. But yeah, I mean, I think from the technology perspective, is what I can say is that we really don't have that blended capability. The way that we've implemented this in the system is the fuel region has one associated pricing hub tied to it.
So when we were, and for just background, it is a single fuel region. So here's what the commitment was, and I know that it's a pain in the butt, that the way that it's done is through an Excel spreadsheet, but the way that it was done when the group that was, or like contemplated to be done as we were working through implementation, is that you have a spreadsheet for all the fuel regions, right? Where you see how they're all formed. That's what you look at. That's your Bible. What we negotiated with stakeholders was that they could identify, let's say, 2 pipelines, 2 trading hubs, provide you with some background and information, and propose to establish, that would be set for a year, a formula that would essentially be a percent of pipeline transport costs plus a percent of pipeline B, so percent of pipeline A transport cost plus percent of pipeline B transport cost plus percent of hub A commodity price plus percent of hub B commodity price. And so what that gets you to is a single GPI, and it is one that we explained, given the functionality, it would be basically a negotiated blended price, and it would be static, so it wouldn't fluctuate. And so, and I know that there's heartburn about the fact that it wouldn't fluctuate, and so how frequently would it need to be updated? The tension here, and I'll stop, but when we talk about choosing, let's say, on our commitment costs, and you say to stakeholders, you have a choice. You can be proxy costs or you can be registered costs. And I mean, maybe not as much anymore, but in the past, you have a choice. And here's the pros and cons of both. It was a similar conversation of, I hear your concerns. You have multiple pipelines. You have multiple hubs. You have some expectation. A blended price will never be your perfect price, but it will allow you to kind of have a consistent view of what that is and set that in place, right? And agree to it for, let's say, a month at a time.
Allowing potentially, 25% of that. So it's essentially a reflection, for lack of better terms, of the 2 potential fuel areas that you could pull from. Got it. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, no, I think that's Go
It's
ahead.
their choice, right? And so I just put it on the table of this was the solution, and it's suboptimal because it's not variable like a proxy. I get that. But it was what we were able to offer at the time. And I don't think your systems have changed significantly from what they were in 2016. So I would suggest to put that solution at least back on the table for us to talk through, and maybe there's a better solution.
Right.
So not proposing to reinvent the wheel, but want to make sure that that was what at least was once proposed and committed to, and then we can talk about a better implementation. But Katie, does that make more sense? It wasn't, we didn't commit to it being variable, it was committed to being static.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. That's helpful context for sure.
Awesome. Okay, so let's, Katie, I'm sorry, did you have another slide before we kind of start diving down the solution?
Yeah, I think there's one or two quick slides. Let's go to slide 20. Yeah, sure. So just quickly speaking to the process for establishing the custom fuel region, like I mentioned, that would be a city ticket submission to the CAISO. So we would be looking for, the natural gas pricing location you're requesting, any of those transport rates that would be associated, and then of course supporting documentation for those parameters, maybe an invoice or a bill, something like that is what we would look for, and then we would work with you to finalize that setup and get that implemented in the system. And then I think I have one last slide, numerical example, for you to go to the next one. Yeah, so here we have a scheduling coordinator who wants to establish a new custom fuel region for their resource. Their resource consumes gas from the SoCal Citygate hub, and say that there's two associated rates that they have to pay to move their gas along the pipeline to the resource, so two transportation costs. So their gas hub would be SoCal Citygate. Let's assume these numerical values for each transportation rate. Those are in $1 per MMBTU basis. So the fuel region price would be that SoCal Citygate price plus the summation of the transport costs. So for example, for today's trading date, we say the SoCal Citygate price is $5. We're adding that $5 along with the 55 cents that comprises the transportation cost, and we're ending up with a fuel region price of $5.55 an MMBTU. So that's going to get sent. That's the fuel region gas price index, GPI, a couple different names for that. That gets sent down into our calculations for the DEBs and the commitment costs, et cetera. And I think that's all I have, Mark, so I'll turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to ask the event producer to jump back up to slides, what is it? I think it's 17, where we kind of first propose the associated problem statement. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. All right, so I heard Kathleen jump in and talk about, reviewing the previous stakeholder item where there was kind of that blended cost between two sources. And the next problem statement 10, the only difference between this one and the next one is the fuel type. So not only the ability to switch fuel sources where the fuel source is the same fuel type, right? Both natural gas, I don't know, both diesel, whatever, both coal. Let's focus on fuel source. And I heard Darren from Idaho earlier state, hey, to the extent we're unable to get any additional gas based on, where they were originally planning on securing their gas. So it sounds like some of that gas is getting delivered, let's say 80% from one source. They have the ability to procure what's left over from a separate source. So I think that's we can table that as two items. One is, do stakeholders need the ability to switch fuel sources in a more timely manner? I think the answer to that is yes. So let's talk about what that looks like. And then the second thing is to the extent you've procured some of your fuel from one source, is there a need to be able to reflect, or how would we reflect those other costs in that separate source? So Darren, do you mind raising your hand and chiming in there? Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer to your question.
So you want to walk us through your scenario again? Maybe just kind of help frame it up.
Yeah, I mean, the custom fuel region, and I appreciate it, Katie, and the information. That's a very simple California-centric example, and there's nothing wrong with that because that's that world, and that's how it exists, and that's reality. But we've got 4 different trading hubs we trade at across 1,500 miles in 3 different states with generation assets in all those states, right? And we're operating on essentially 3 pipelines. We've got storage assets that are 1,200 miles apart from each other, and we're on bi-directional pipes. So, let's also add that we financially hedge at 3 different hubs. And I won't name all this stuff because I'm sure you can figure out where Idaho's at and triangulate around us. Yeah, but the fuel region composition limits, they don't prudently manage our costs at Idaho. And so the problem statements, I think, fairly, I just wanted to illustrate that. So thanks for hearing that again. And it used to be fairly simple. There was some seasonality on normal years you could put into there and kind of pick, through your master file, kind of how you wanted to price it, and you might get close and be kind of protected. But those days are gone with the volatility that we're seeing. And so I'm not certain on how it works for our geography, how we sit out here and how we procure gas on the day. I mean, in reality, we could be buying gas as soon as Washington and trying to float it to Wyoming. Or we might we could be going backwards depending on if there's a Texas freeze out or if things are normal or if it's cold up in the Northwest or not. And so it's difficult, you're right, to blend all that, put that together and have that being represented. And we want the optionality. We don't want to be held down. So if I can buy gas at one point and optimize that way, I want to be able to do that. I don't want to be held hostage to a fuel zone that's limited to the hub or to one specific pricing. So I guess that in a nutshell is the problem. I don't know if I have a solution, but I know my predecessor, speaking on to what Kathleen had talked about, the request was out there, and I think that Mike Polito had presented that way back when in 17 or 16, whenever these conversations were happening, and saying, hey, we've got a problem here. If you're going to limit us, it really could have a major impact on our cost and our recovery and our bidding and what we're actually paying for fuel and what's going on in the markets due to all these dynamics. So I'll be quiet and listen now. Thanks.
No, I really appreciate that, Darren. And let me. So I heard you state, hey, we potentially for a given generator in a scenario could pull from 3 different sources. Those 3 different sources, to the extent you say, okay, I'm going to pull from source A, you want the ability to be able to reflect source A's price in those calculated costs. Are you saying you potentially could switch that source then in real time, or I want to make sure I was following you when you say you didn't want to be locked in?
Yeah, the reality is I could buy gas, procure it for a day ahead, and then have to put it back or want to put it back in storage and procure from something intraday the next day. So there's a lot of dynamic moving pieces there. And with the flows and how these pipes work in conjunction with each other between Idaho, Wyoming, Nevada, all the way up to Washington and through Oregon, there's lots of different places to pick up gas. There's lots of different ways to do things. And I've just, and also sometimes you can't do anything and you might think you'll be able to do something and then you get into a real time versus a day ahead market and you don't have that ability. For example, during a Texas freeze out, you've got to pay south of Meacham compressor, which is on Northwest Pipeline. You might have to pay hundreds of dollars, which is what we were constrained to. I couldn't get gas at $5 or $8 from Oregon or from Washington. And so had I been held to our Stanfield, kind of our hybrid, pricing fuel region at that point in time, it would have ended poorly. I mean, we would have had to go through recovery and so forth and all that, but I'm trying to avoid that. So yes, so flexibility on some days, lack of flexibility on others. And that's what you get when you don't sit behind a city gate and with all of your assets in arm's length. You can't balance effectively the same way every day, and the world is different.
Got it. Now I'm curious. So going back under what Kathleen stated earlier with the blended costs, that flexibility would then allow you to, okay, I understand what the calculated cost is because it's blended, and then at least some of those costs are baked in to the extent you go with a higher cost, but then you have that flexibility from an overall gas management perspective to potentially change that source in real time. That's good context, and I appreciate that, Darren. Sylvie, did you have, or Katie, did you have anything to weigh in here? I see Dwight with his hand from Arizona again. Let's go to Dwight. You may be muted on your side, Dwight.
Purchase at 20% a different region. Speaking once again from just a real-time perspective, if I, typically when I'm purchasing that extra gas, it's for exports to in the EIM market. So in my preference, I'd like to be able to raise that price 100% to that new, to where I purchased that gas from, because the other gas that I have, my customers are already, I want to provide the best price to my customers before exporting that extra gas. And so if I have a blend of something, my customers would be subsidizing those exports, and my preference is to avoid that.
Okay, so I think I heard you say you're on the other end where the blending may not make sense. Did I follow that correctly? You broke up a little bit in the beginning. You're on mute again, Dwight, if you muted your line. Or it looks like the WebEx muted you. Sorry about that.
No, I'm used to triggering the mute. My apologies. Yeah, so once, I'd be on the other end.
Okay.
I'd want to be able to raise my price to the highest price that I purchase gas.
Okay, so you're saying if you're utilizing that gas, then it makes sense to reflect those costs, but providing the flexibility to potentially pull gas from a different source at a lower price may or potentially could inflate prices. Is that your concern there?
No, I just, all I'd like to do is just to go up to the highest price that I purchased. If we see something different, we can lower our price. Having that flexibility would be good, yes.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so less of a blend, more of, hey, let's understanding that these are my potential three sources, utilize in the calculation the highest of those prices, and allow for bidding flexibility, obviously, to bid below 100% of that calculated cost to the extent the entity decides to pull from the lower cost.
Correct.
For its fuel source. Got it. Okay, I'm with you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Kathleen, I would like to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is great. I want to, this is more of a question for other stakeholders, if that's okay, Mark.
Yeah, please.
So I'm thinking through this and trying to think through, the functionality at the same time. So like if you have two participants, I just reiterate, the blended hub idea is voluntary. So let's say you have one who likes it. One entity says, I like setting up a blended hub because it'll get me closer in most days to what I expect my cost to be than a single hub. So they make that choice. Another entity should be able to say, I don't like that. I want to pick the hub I use from most of the time, and then that's the one I want to be my kind of like default. So question for all the Idaho, that APS who were just talking. So if you're thinking about this from these two choices, if your actual costs are lower, you can always submit prices or offers that are below that. I'm sure you know the CAISO's market takes the lower offer and not just their default. So the choice that you make on a hub or a pipeline is actually lower than your default GPI. Your bidding can ensure the CAISO's market takes that. So I assume we're all good on the lower side, but that's one question. On the higher side, my second scenario for y'all is, okay, so if you're comfortable, you can fully manage when you have a lower option. But when there's a higher option, you want to be able to whether, and I assume it doesn't matter if you have a blended or a single hub fuel region at that point, because the question is really more when your expected costs are higher than whatever your default GPI is. So if it's higher, I would assume you would submit a reference level adjustment that includes that higher fuel cost. It would be capped. If it is capped, you'd go through that after the fact. If you submit the city ticket that we talked about earlier. So can the folks who were just talking with those examples help us understand what is it about? Because Mark, you have a potential solution here that to me says submit a reference level adjustment. So I'm trying to understand what is it about the reference level adjustment that is meant to allow you to increase your dev and proxy costs to that higher choice in real time. What is not working, or is there something I'm missing?
Or yeah, and let me maybe caveat that a little bit as a facilitator, Kathleen, and I appreciate you framing it that way. Is I heard the deadline was the challenge. So if there wasn't a deadline challenge, would this be an issue?
I like it.
Yeah, so let's good question. So let me pose that back to the extent, Darren, you were comfortable chiming back in and then I know we had APS on the line as well. So to the extent one of you wanted to chime in, or anyone from the audience wanted to chime in, I'd appreciate it. Darren, thank you. Event producer, can you unmute Darren's line, please?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern for us is it's clumsy. The timing of it doesn't work. That's when we're out procuring gas. We're balancing. I mean, we have a trading floor and we have schedulers, and they're constantly doing. This adds another layer. So then we've got to. I mean, I guess it comes down to do I got to hire another person, 2 people to do this? Maybe so.
Gotcha.
I mean, that goes in the cost overlay. But if you're asking traders to do this under the current platform, the timing is very, very not advantageous. It actually gets in the way. And I think for me, the main crux is the timing. And then you're right. You get into all the other processes that are behind it, which no one wants to do. I'll be honest with you. I don't want to do that. My guys don't want to do that. My girls don't want to do that. They want to trade. They want to get deals done. They don't want to deal with the bureaucracy of going through this when these events happen. And I don't foresee this happening a lot, but the reality is it certainly could. We're in a volatile market, more volatile than I've seen in the 20 years I've been in the industry. So it's.
So Darren, if kind of leveraging what the gentleman from APS was stating, to the extent the higher of those 3 regions could be reflected, and going back to what Kathleen just stated, where the associated entity would have the ability to lower that reference costs, right? Their min load and startup costs being utilized by the market, or risk not being in the market, right? Bidding themselves, making their costs higher than whatever the marginal energy cost is trading at. Do you feel that would get your team in the appropriate position to reflect what you're looking to reflect at that point in time without potentially leveraging some of these other processes?
I think if I heard the question right, and let me simplify it with my
please
with my brain the way I heard it. Can I adjust pricing on the fly up and down?
Yes, understanding that the only caveat there is understanding that the reference price used in determining what would be your 125% cap would be the highest of those 3 areas.
Which 3 areas? The highest of
the 3 potential sources, going back to our hypothetical scenario. Right. So if you had a $5 price, a $6 price, and a $6.50 price, the index price would be based on the $6.50. And then to the extent you guys were going to procure from a cheaper source because you had that ability, you would have the flexibility to lower your calculated min load and startup cost below that 100% kind of base price there.
Potentially, but I guess one of the problems might be a side effect of having a higher price in there Because if you don't get that change, then you're showing, you know, unwarranted benefits if your unit was mitigated down and it's not being, you know, in this case, you know, decreased appropriately based. And then we've got to manage that. That I think comes down to the shippers or the entities that the folks on the line here. So I don't know. I need to think about that, but
Okay.
it feels like that would be a potential solution. Yeah. I mean, it feels
Okay.
like
Okay. Yeah, I mean, looking throughout these into all of these working groups, which I really appreciate everyone's engagement in. I think some of these potential solutions that we've been kicked around definitely have interplay with some of the other problems. So it'll be interesting to see where we land as a group. Thank you, Darren. I appreciate you weighing in. Any other comments or thoughts here on? All right, Jennifer. Let's go to Jennifer's line. Jennifer, you may be on mute on your end. Oh, there you go. I hear you now.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I wanted to clarify Kaiso's point there that if you can procure fuel from multiple locations that have different prices, is Kaiso saying that you should just set your reference level at your, you know, most expensive and then have the ability to select a less expensive one, even if you are not primarily or most frequently using the most expensive source? Am I hearing that correctly?
No. So the Kaiso, and I'll let Katie jump in, or Sylvie from policy. I was just simply trying to summarize kind of some of the comments I've heard to this point in this discussion, and that's really what's up for discussion is, you know, how, to the extent a resource has the ability to pull from multiple areas or fuel hubs here, sources, what is the best way to allow them to reflect the costs that they're incurring utilizing a certain source? Like, let's say they're registered to fuel source A that's at $5, and for whatever reason they had to procure from fuel source B at $7. How do we reflect that is kind of what we're trying to tackle right now, and I would love your thoughts on that.
Correct. Yeah. And so what I thought I heard Kaiso say was to, you know, ensure that the resource has the opportunity to reflect their accurate price. They should be using fuel source B, the higher one, as their reference level to maintain that flexibility. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
As,
So let
as
me
an option.
Yeah, let me go to Katie, because I kind of envisioned this as the tool would say, hey, I see price A, I see price B. We're going to leverage the one of the ideas that have been kicked around on this call is leveraging the higher of those two costs versus the blending of those two costs, and utilizing that in the calculation, and then that kind of sets your base at 100%, and then the entity has the ability, or the scheduling coordinator has the ability to lower that cost to the extent they're, you know, it's not reflective of what they're actually procuring.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, this is Katie. I think it's a good discussion, and, you know, there's a lot of different ways we could think about implementation solutions to tackle this, and I'm not sure that we're prepared to go into the specifics now, but I think generally, to the extent that, you know, there's a higher price that's used in the calculation, sort of in keeping with a marginal pricing methodology, you know, that's the highest price might be what puts you at the margin for those fuel costs. You know, if those are filtered in, of course, it's up to the scheduling coordinator and how their costs are playing out on their side of how to bid. I mean, currently, you know, if take an example, if we're using a $5 fuel price in the calculations of your reference levels, and, you know, you only had to procure fuel at $4, you know, it's up to you, up to that 125% cap, how high you want to submit those bids. So I think that's certainly something we can explore kind of down the line.
Right. Yeah. And I think my confusion is coming from the question of is the reference price representative of your bids, or is it the worst case scenario? And I'm just I was a little confused on that, but I think I understand what you're saying from the solution set.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate your comments. Kathleen, I see you back in the queue.
Yes, thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have another question as I listened to that discussion, which was crazy helpful, by the way. So my another question I'd like to tease out is when I think about the mitigated prices or the reference levels, I kind of bucket them in my head to like normal days or stress days. So for simplicity, I'm only thinking about normal days and not like a stress day because that gets more complicated. So if it's all right, I'm going to put those to the side. But so like most of the days that exist throughout the year, the reference levels on the commitment costs, obviously those are cost-based offers by tariff. So they are capped at 125. There's that. But there's also mitigation on the energy offers, which have the price cap, but if they're mitigated down to their mitigated price. One thing I'm a little confused about in the conversation is whether the problem statement is on both proxy costs and the DEB, or if the problem, so like GPI feeds into both, but is it challenges with proxy cost always, like your commitment cost offers are always subject to mitigation 24/7. That's just the design. It's a cost-based offer. Until there's mitigation applied to those offers, you're not going to get a price-based offer. Is that the problem? Or is the problem on the energy side that there's frequency of mitigation occurring where when I would think about normal days, there's some mitigation, but frequent mitigation for gas units should be triggering a frequent mitigated unit adder, right? So we should be talking about the FMU adder as well, if it's frequent mitigation. And I'll stop there, but those are kind of my two questions. Is this a mitigation question that's only impacting the commitment cost, or is it impacting both in folks' mind? And maybe if we can unpack that next, we can get a better sense of what we're looking for, because I'm hearing, I just wonder if we're talking about the problem yet, and maybe if we could just focus a little bit more on that. And Mark, would you help me recharacterize my question? Did that make sense to you? Any way you want?
I can try. I think when we were talking about, that's right. I think when we framed this up through the working group, it was kind of in the context of both, to answer your question, right? Not only in your associated offer itself, but those DEBs as well, right? Obviously, those costs need to reflect the associated correct price also. But I see Sylvie from our side, from policy, raise her hand. So let me go to Sylvie, and then I'm going to go to you, Dwight. I appreciate everyone's thoughts and engagement here.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Kathleen, because you stole the question right out of my mouth. I had wanted to jump in after Jennifer's comment, just to provide a little bit of background on the incentives and the reason why we usually take the lower price hub. That's because we assume when you're out procuring gas that you're looking for the lower cost. So we wouldn't necessarily assume for the worst case scenario all the time. And therefore, we're trying to get, the problem we're trying to get at here is when do these worst case scenarios occur? Are they reliability reasons? Do we have like time before they happen that might suggest a different path besides having, this default hub difference? So yeah, just characterizing the solution a little bit more. What are the incentives or the scenarios in which we end up having to get gas from a higher priced hub, which seems to be not the optimal decision for most resources.
Thank you, Sylvie. All right, let's go to Dwight and then Darren.
When we're purchasing gas at 125% more, the value at the reference location.
I'm sorry, I could barely hear you, Dwight. Do you mind speaking up just a little bit?
Yeah. when we make those purchases at 125%, we have to make that decision as to how our, what is that going to do to our market, right? And typically we do that because, when we make those purchases, because that's our only option, whether it's delivered gas, that's, after some congestion is going on. And so really that's our only option. And so doing that will take us out of the market. So I have to figure out, when I purchase this gas, am I going to be able to raise my prices? Because if I don't, I might continue to export out gas that I don't have. And that might bring me in, ultimately, I think that's kind of what we're forgetting, is that there is a limited amount of gas that we have. And, I can't just do bid mitigation because, the pipeline might, flow control me or do something to that aspect. So by raising that price, we can remain in the market if, by, allowing me to go out and purchase that gas and continue to offer out energy. But if I can't put that in the bid cost recovery, then that's going to change my calculation, and that might, take me out of the market.
Yeah, no, okay, so you're saying, you need the flexibility to reflect those associated costs, and to the extent you can't, you're looking for a means to recover those costs, quote unquote, easily. Right, I heard you mention BCR there. I'm trying to understand, and is there a physical, I think of a gas pipeline outage, for example, where, I heard the market side of things where from a market perspective, you may want to choose a different gas source, but, in real time or, 2 days prior, going back to the ISO's process today requires that 10 business days. If a gas pipeline goes out and you have to pull from a different source, and that source is not mapped to your unit and master file, that's kind of where my mind went when we started talking about this problem. Is the physical side of things not necessarily the issue, and it's more of a marketing item here? Can you guys help me? And Darren, I mean Dwight, excuse me. I know you're already unmuted, so let's hear what you got to say.
For us, it's usually the physical. Once
Okay.
we have to switch from to a different location, it becomes a physical problem, and that's where because you're right. Typically, from a day ahead to an intraday, we're not seeing these events happen very often, right? But it's those stress days, and I think that's kind of where I appreciate that connection. Maybe it's like usually when we do any sort of reference level change request, it's a stress day. It's not a normal operating day. And so we are seeing those differences. There's congestion in the pipeline, and we had to switch to another location, and things of that sort. So that's, I think that's a good point to make.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, let's go to Darren. Event producer, do you mind unmuting Darren's line? Darren, you may have to raise your hand again just so we get you. There we go.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Took my hand down prematurely. Kathleen, it's a stress day. I would agree. It ties into both. That's where we run into a problem, and it's physical. To your question, Mark, operationally, again, bidirectional pipe, gas flows. Sometimes day to day it changes directions depending on what's going on, what events are how weather patterns are flowing in different geographic regions. And so the constraints created by that, the bottlenecks, whatever you want to call them, are where we get limited through the compressors. And so we're oversubscribed, going different directions on a bidirectional pipe that relies on displacement. So that tells you once you get through your timely nomination, if you don't have your gas in, you're not getting it in. If you're going with everyone else, now you're forced to go to the opposite end of the pipe and buy from some other hub at a much higher price, because that's what the net back is. That's what the net flows are trying to do to make that market. And so that's what we're talking about, I think, to summarize it.
Got it. No, I appreciate that. That helps me. Okay, so I don't think. Oh, I saw Kathleen jump back up, because I think we at least have a good level set on the issue and the need to be able to reflect the appropriate costs. I don't think we've landed on how to reflect that appropriate costs in a timely manner, understanding the mapping and master file and things like that. So let me go to Kathleen, and then I'm going to go to Janice from PAC.
Yeah, no, thank you. Super, super helpful. So distinguishing between a normal versus a stress day is a key element of, I think, the problem statement. And the reason it is so important is that on a stress day, there may be a lot of mitigation. And so this becomes a lot more, and I know it becomes more sensitive. But the other thing is that on a stress day, it's really critical that the market itself is sending the signals that it is stressed, that it's leading up to a stress period and that we're in a stress period. That can sometimes be reflective of the offers that are submitted, but it can also be reflective of market design choices to ensure that we are reflecting scarcity leading up to and during a stress period. And that is within scope of a different working group, Mark, and I know that, but I need to tie it to that working group because that working group is struggling with this specific problem. And that's why I thought that we weren't talking about that problem.
You beat me to it. I was gonna say, Kathleen, go tell them over there. No, I agree.
I'm gonna go tell them.
I think we have to. I think that's a good plug, and I know Sylvie's on here, and Sylvie is, I don't know how, but she's in all the working groups. So I'll have Sylvie take that action item to make sure the groups are connecting those dots. And for those that are participating in this working group, when you start talking about scarcity pricing and all that other fun stuff, price formation enhancements is a working group that's going on. They're talking about a lot of complex related matters to markets and how to appropriately price things. So if you're interested in that and want to weigh in there, I would definitely encourage you to participate in that. So thank you for that, Kathleen. I think that was important to note.
Yeah, and if I can just add a little, so everyone who may not be participating there is aware mitigation and BAA level mitigation is being discussed. And so this exact question of when BAA level mitigation is triggered and all of your resources within your area are mitigated, especially on days. And so what does the pricing need to look like so that there isn't any harm imposed on you as a market participant? So I want to crystallize that is within scope of that working group and it is being discussed. So defer to the CAISO on how you want to merge it. But if that's the problem statement, I see it there. But before
sorry. Yeah, no. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead, Kathleen.
I just want to say, but on the normal day, we still need to talk about the normal day because the normal day, there are still instances, especially in certain areas of the WEC, and especially in these areas that we've been giving these examples where the prices are potential, like that for fuel costs may exceed that 125% cap on the proxy costs. So part of why I asked if it's commitment cost or energy is I see the energy piece coming into play more on a stress day and that's being tackled for the most part in price formation. But on a normal day, commitment costs are mitigated all the time. They are defined as cost-based bids. That is a part of the current tariff. So if that is limiting participation in the normal days, then the problem statement, I would refine the problem statement to commitment costs are being mitigated 100% of the time. And so on normal days, there's losses being incurred by participants or challenges in management. And so in that instance, as everybody knows, the proposed solution is to allow for market-based commitment cost bids subject to mitigation. When mitigated, it would be mitigated to the cost. So it would pivot the commitment cost participation more like energy and only mitigate it when it is subject to mitigation. And that is something that would allow for would allow for better management of the gas resources and other resources, but all resources on normal days. So I'll tee it back to kind of refocus on normal days. Is that still a problem? because I can tell you a couple years ago, it was a huge problem. And that's why there is a proposed solution and a design for mitigating commitment costs that's specific to commitment cost market power that the CAISO has and can implement.
Thank you, Kathleen. Janice, I saw your hand go down. Did you still have a comment and wanted to raise it again so we can unmute your line? I'm not seeing your hand shoot back up. Maybe your question or clarification or comment was just expressed by either Kathleen or some of the other commenters. All right, so I'm looking at the time. I think we're almost at the top of the hour. Fantastic working group session. I really appreciate everyone's engagement. We did not get into problem statement 10, which again is heavily related here. The only delta between being, instead of different fuel hubs and sources, it's the actual type of fuel. Do units have the ability to switch between their types of fuel? And if so, how is that managed today? How are those costs reflected? And I think what we'll do, because we are going to be offering some comments on today's working group session, so we'll make sure to kind of frame those comments around some of the solutions we've heard to get individuals' thoughts, and definitely look forward to the next working group. So if you wouldn't mind, let's jump to what's next real quick. I'm going to go down a few more slides, keep on going, and then one more slide. Let's go through this. We don't need to go through the scenarios. I think we kind of organically did that through discussion, which was great. So let's go back one more slide just so I can kind of show everybody what was the currently proposed schedule. So today was the 7th. We had the working group. We're going to be putting out some comments. We're going to be asking for those comments to try to be responded to by, I believe, the end of next week, understanding that there's some holidays and things in there. And we don't want folks working too hard over the holiday breaks. And what we're going to be doing next is talking on January 9th around problem statements 1 through 4, as well as providing some analysis that was requested for some of the data. So look forward to sharing that. We have a January 23rd on hold. So to the extent, we need to talk again about some of the items we did today. Depending on what those comments look like on January 23rd, we can absolutely do that. And then we'll move on to February 21st and March 26th to kind of start tackling some of the other problem statements. Again, really appreciate everyone's time. This is exactly what we're looking for in these discussions. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thank you for being kind. Have a good one.